Hi there. I'm really glad you found your way back here tonight. Wherever you happen to be curled up right now, a couch that has gone a little too soft in the middle, a bed with one too many pillows, maybe even a car seat with the engine still ticking as it cools down, just settle in. You do not need to do anything else right now. Just breathe and let your shoulders drop an inch or two. That is honestly the only job you have this evening. No notes to take, no dates to memorize, nothing at all besides letting your eyes get a little heavier with every sentence. Because tonight we're stepping back a very long way. Most people picture the ancient world as small, scattered kingdoms, each one keeping to itself behind its own walls, barely aware the others even existed. But that picture is almost entirely wrong. 3,000 years ago there was a world every bit as connected as ours kings, who called each other brother in writing ships, that carried cargo from half a dozen different lands, stacked in the same hold, and a peace treaty so carefully built that a copy of it still sits under glass inside the United Nations headquarters today. And then, in the space of roughly one human lifetime, almost all of it came apart. We will get to that unraveling. We really will. But not tonight. Tonight, before anything breaks, I want you to see what this world looked like while it was still working, while it was in its own strange bronze and clay way, nearer to a single global economy than anything humanity would build again for thousands of years. Before we go any further, though, let me ask one small favor. If stories like this one already feel a little like home to you, like a subscribe, even just a comment helps far more than you would guess. It simply tells me you would like more nights like this one. And if you have got a spare second before your eyes get heavy, tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you're sitting. I take in every one of those little check-ins more often than you would think, and they make this whole thing feel less like a video and more like company. Now if you can dim the lights around you, maybe switch on a fan or a soft rain sound, something low and steady humming underneath my voice. And once you're settled, let us slip backward together into a night 3,000 years old. Tonight begins a long, slow walk through the final years of the ancient world's first great age of peace, through burning palaces and unanswered letters, through kings who vanished without a single battle, and a mysterious people the Egyptians simply called those from the sea. But we are not rushing there yet. Tonight we start at the top back when everything still worked. Picture a harbour on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, somewhere along the coast of what is now southern Turkey, late in the afternoon around 1300 BC. The sun is dropping fast toward the water, throwing long orange light across a small wooden ship. A captain whose name history never bothered to write down walks along the dock one final time, counting crates by torchlight. Under his bare feet, the wood of the pier is still warm from the day. The air smells of pine resin salt and the faint sharpness of hot metal cooling somewhere nearby. Somewhere behind him, someone is arguing over the price of a jar of oil. Somewhere else, a rope creaks under the weight it is holding, and a gull calls once far out over water gone the colour of dark honey in the last of the light. This ship is not carrying cargo for a great king. It belongs to a private trader, one of thousands quietly moving up and down this coast every season. And yet sitting in its hold tonight are 10 tons of copper, shaped into thick, 4-handled ingots so heavy that 2 grown men are needed to lift just one. Beside the copper sits almost a ton of tin mined from mountains more than 1,000 miles inland in what is now central Turkey, and possibly further still near what is today Afghanistan. Together, that copper and that tin are the only 2 ingredients needed to make bronze. The metal an entire age would eventually be named after, but the copper and the tin are only the beginning. Tucked between the ingots are jars of resin from the forests of Canaan, chunks of raw glass in blue and turquoise from somewhere near the Egyptian coast, tusks of ivory ebony logs so dark they look almost wet in torchlight, and gold jewellery crafted in a style historians would later trace back to the Aegean Islands. Somewhere among all of it, small strands of amber beads sit wrapped in cloth beads that, based on their chemical makeup, appear to have started their journey near the Baltic Sea, thousands of miles to the north. Stop and sit with that for a moment. One small ship, cargo from Cyprus, from Egypt, from the Levant, from the Aegean, from deep inland Anatolia, possibly from the edge of northern Europe, all stacked together in one wooden hold headed for a destination none of us will ever know for certain. How does that even happen? Who agreed to all of this? Who decided that a jar of resin from one coastline belonged next to a tusk sent from an entirely different continent? Was there a king somewhere issuing orders for every shipment, tracking it all on clay tablets inside a palace archive? Or was this simply how private merchants worked, filling their holds wherever they found a good deal, chasing profit from harbour to harbour, with no royal instructions at all? Historians are still split on that question. Some argue this kind of trade was tightly managed, run almost like a state industry, with palace scribes recording every ingot that left a royal warehouse. Others believe most of what we are looking at, ships like this one, especially belong to independent traders working the coastline on their own judgment, nearer to small business owners than government employees. Maybe the truth sits somewhere in the middle part, royal cargo part private hustle, tangled together in the same hold. Or, and this might be the most honest answer of all, maybe we're simply too far removed now, more than 3,000 years, to ever fully untangle who was really in charge. What we do know is this: that ship and hundreds like it formed the quiet and glamorous backbone of an entire age. Pick up just one of those copper ingots for a moment in your mind. Run your hand along its shape. It is not a simple slab. Someone has cast it with 4 stubby corners sticking out almost like the stretched hide of an animal pinned out to dry, and it weighs nearly 60 pounds every single time, almost no matter where you find one. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Archaeologists have pulled these exact ingots, this exact shape, this exact rough weight out of shipwrecks off Turkey, out of temple storerooms in Cyprus, out of graves in Sardinia, and out of ruins in Greece and Israel. Different languages, different gods painted on different palace walls. And yet somehow everyone along this coastline had quietly agreed on what a fair unit of copper was supposed to look like, and how much it was supposed to weigh. Most of us grow up assuming money, real money, something everyone trusts the value of without arguing over it, only began once actual coins were struck centuries later in a kingdom called Lydia. But stand on this dock long enough, and that assumption starts to wobble a little. Was a shape and a weight like this one truly functioning as an early kind of currency, trusted the same way from Egypt to the Aegean, or was it simply a convenient way to ship raw copper without it sliding around in the hold? Some historians argue these ingots were near enough to money to matter a shared standard that let a Cypriot merchant and a Canaanite palace agree on value without a single shared word of language between them. Others are more careful, pointing out we cannot prove anyone haggled over these the way we haggle over currency today. Maybe it really was an early form of truss-cast in metal. Maybe it was only ever a practical shipping shape that happened to spread. Or quietest of all, maybe the two things were never as different from each other as we like to imagine. Now here is where the story gets honestly a little sweeter. While merchants like our nameless captain were hauling copper and glass along the coastline, something even more remarkable was happening in the palaces above them. 2 of the most powerful men alive, who had spent nearly 2 decades trying to kill each other, had just done something almost nobody expected. For years, the Egyptian king Rameses the Great and the Hittite king Hattusili III had fought over a stretch of contested land in the Levant, most famously at a city called Kadesh, in a battle so massive that both sides would later claim rather awkwardly to have won it outright. Chariots by the thousands, armies dragged across deserts for weeks, and at the end of it all nothing was truly settled. Neither empire could fully defeat the other, and both were quietly running low on money, grain, and patience to keep trying. So in a move that must have startled scribes on both sides, the 2 kings did something almost nobody in that era had managed before. They stopped fighting, permanently, on purpose, in writing. Around 1259, BC Egyptian and Hittite officials sat down and produced what many historians now consider the oldest complete peace treaty in human history, whose exact wording still survives. It was carved onto a silver tablet inside the Hittite capital and copied in hieroglyphics onto the walls of temples in Egypt. The text calls on 1,000 gods from both kingdoms at once to stand as witnesses: storm gods, sun goddesses, mountain spirits, and river deities, all listed by name, all asked to guard the same fragile promise between two former enemies. In it, the two kings addressed each other again and again using one particular word: brother. Not conquered enemy, not lesser rival, brother. A handful of years later, the alliance grew even nearer when Rameses married a Hittite princess, sealing the peace with a family bond as well as a legal one. Picture that scene for a moment. A royal procession moving south from the Hittite highlands, gifts loaded onto carts, an entire diplomatic marriage, designed less around love and far more around making sure two exhausted empires never had to fight again. So what changed those two men from enemies willing to bury each other under a battlefield into rulers who wrote letters that opened with the word brother? Was it something like real friendship forged strangely out of years of shared exhaustion? Or was it simply cold calculation? Two overstretched kingdoms realizing peace was cheaper than war. Some historians lean toward pure strategy, arguing neither king could afford another campaign like Kadesh again. Others point to the warmth in the surviving letters, the small personal touches, and wonder if something like real respect grew between these two men over time, almost despite themselves. Maybe it really was just strategy. Maybe something like real regard grew there too quietly, the way it sometimes does even between former rivals. Or quietest of all, maybe both were true at once, tangled together the way most real peace usually is. And here is the detail that tends to make people smile a little once they hear it. A copy of that same treaty, the Hittite version, sits today inside the halls of the United Nations building in New York, presented as one of history's earliest working examples of international diplomacy. 3,000 years later, and it is still being pointed to as proof that peace even between old enemies can actually hold. This peace did not exist in isolation either. By this point, historians count as many as 8 major powers spread across this world: Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, Assyria, Babylon, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, and the copper-rich island of Cyprus. Among them all loosely bound together through trade, marriage, and correspondence. None of them was strong enough or foolish enough to try ruling all the others outright. Instead, they settled into something nearer to a very old, very slow version of a members' club, one where every king addressed his equals as brother, and every insult, every unpaid debt, every broken promise had to be handled with a letter, instead of an army, at least for now. Royal scribes across these courts wrote almost entirely in one shared language, a form of Akkadian cuneiform, meaning a message from Egypt could in theory be understood the moment it reached a palace, hundreds of miles away in a completely different kingdom, with a completely different native tongue. If you have ever grumbled about a package taking a few extra days to arrive, spare a small thought for a Hittite scribe waiting 4 or 5 months for a single letter to travel from Egypt and back only to find the wax seal cracked or the message garbled by a translator 3 courts removed from the original, and yet the system worked patiently, letter by letter, ingot by ingot, marriage by marriage, for generation after generation. It is worth sitting with that picture for a moment before we move forward. This was not a primitive, disconnected world of isolated little villages. It was nearer to an early fragile version of globalization built out of bronze clay tablets, royal marriages, and enormous trust placed in ships crossing open water, with no real way to call for help if something went wrong. And that trust, that deep, sprawling web of needing each other, tin from one place, grain from another, soldiers loaned between allies, princesses exchanged as living proof of loyalty, would hold this world together beautifully for generations. But webs like that carry a particular kind of danger hidden inside them. The more threads tying everyone together, the more the whole structure depends on every single thread staying intact. Pull hard enough on just one, a bad harvest here, a broken trade route there, and you do not just weaken one kingdom, you put pressure on all of them at once. That pressure is exactly where we're headed next, into the quiet cracks that started forming underneath all this shared wealth and borrowed peace. Small at first, easy to miss, the kind of cracks a palace scribe might have noted on a tablet and set aside without a second thought. Stay with me right where you are. The lights are already low. The next part of this night is only a breath away. There is a particular kind of trouble that never arrives with noise. No armies, no burning gates, just a season that turns out a little drier than the one before it, and then another season drier still, and then somewhere around the 3rd or 4th year of that pattern, a person standing in a field starts to understand that this is no longer bad luck. This is simply the new shape of the world. That is where our story picks back up tonight, in exactly that kind of quiet. Picture a harbour on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, a place the old texts call Ura, roughly a century after that famous peace treaty was carved into silver. A line of ships sits low in the water, their hulls packed edge to edge with sacks of barley and wheat timbers groaning softly with every small swell that rolls beneath them. Dock workers move along wooden ramps under a hard afternoon sun, counting sacks out loud, checking each one against a tally scratched onto a wax-covered board, sweat darkening the linen across their shoulders. None of them are loading these ships. They are unloading them as fast as human hands can manage, because every single grain inside those sacks has already been promised to somewhere else, somewhere inland, somewhere running out of time. That grain is bound for the Hittite capital, and it did not come from a bumper harvest anyone was proud of. It came from Egypt. An Egyptian king named Merneptah, ruling in the final years of the 13th century before the Common Era, later had his own scribes carve a boast onto stone, describing how he had ordered ships loaded with grain and sent north so the land of the Hittites would not starve. Take in that sentence for a moment slowly. One of the 2 most powerful kingdoms on the planet, an empire that had spent generations fighting Egypt for territory, was now surviving at least in part because Egypt chose to keep the shipments coming. Years later, the crisis had only tightened its grip. A Hittite king named Tudaliah sent an urgent message south. Not a polite request this time, but something nearer to a demand addressed to the king of the coastal city of Ugarit. He needed a ship. He needed a crew. And he needed them to carry 450 tons of grain back to his kingdom immediately, because in his own words this had become a matter between survival and something far worse. Sit with that number for a second. 450 tons moved by hand, by rope, by wooden hull, across open water that could turn violent without warning, all because the alternative was letting an empire go hungry. Here is the piece that tends to stop people mid-breath once they hear it. In peaceful, steady years, this arrangement had actually worked beautifully. It was in a strange Bronze Age sort of way, the entire alliance system, from 100 years earlier, finally proving its worth. Kings who called each other brother actually behaving like brothers when it mattered most. But the moment those shipping routes came under any kind of pressure storms, piracy, a single delayed harvest somewhere else in the chain, the whole arrangement stopped feeling clever and started feeling fragile. So was Hatti facing an actual kingdom-ending famine here, or was this simply a rough patch, the sort every ancient state weathered now and then, being handled exactly the way the system was designed to handle it? Some historians take these letters as proof of a slow, grinding collapse already underway. Others caution us not to overreact, pointing out that begging letters between allies were fairly ordinary correspondence in this world, and one dramatic sentence does not necessarily mean an entire population was starving. Maybe it really was catastrophic and the surviving letters only capture a fraction of the suffering. Maybe it was nearer to a serious but survivable strain, dramatized a little in the writing, the way people still dramatize things under pressure today. Or, and this might be the option, modern historians lean toward without quite saying it out loud. Maybe both were true, depending on exactly which town you happened to be standing in that particular year, and Hatti was not the only kingdom whose fields had started failing. Around this same stretch of decades, similar signs were quietly turning up everywhere. Researchers thought to look in lake mud pulled from beneath the island of Cyprus, in river sediment along the coast of Syria, even in a shallow lagoon buried under the modern Nile Delta. Different countries, different soil, different languages entirely, all recording almost in unison the same slow turn toward dryness. This was never a single kingdom's bad luck. It was something nearer to a shared weather system, quietly leaning against an entire region at once, for longer than any king on that coastline had been alive to remember otherwise. Now for a moment, let's step completely out of the ancient world. A very different kind of scene, one you might actually recognize. A small team of scientists on a modern research boat anchored somewhere over the Sea of Galilee or the Dead Sea, slowly lowering a hollow metal tube down through dark water and into the mud below. What they are pulling back up is not treasure. It is a long cylinder of layered sediment packed with something almost impossibly small grains of ancient pollen, thousands of years old, preserved in undisturbed mud like pages in a book nobody had opened yet. Under a microscope, each layer of that pollen tells scientists what kind of trees and plants were growing nearby the year that specific layer settled. And when researchers work their way through the layers matching this exact stretch of history, they found something remarkable. A long unmistakable shift toward drier, tougher vegetation. A shift that lasted by some estimates well over a century. More recently, a separate team studying ancient juniper tree rings pinned something even sharper inside that same slow crisis. 3 brutal consecutive years of drought landing almost exactly on top of the years the Hittite kingdom went silent for good. For a long stretch of the last century, most popular retellings of this collapse skipped straight past all of this. They preferred the simpler, punchier version, an empire minding its own business suddenly overrun by outside invaders with no warning at all. It made for a cleaner story. It is also based on everything sitting inside these tree rings, and these lake cores most likely wrong, or at the very least deeply incomplete. The truth those rings point toward is slower, quieter, and honestly a little sadder. Whatever violence was still coming for this world, and there was plenty of it still coming, it was not arriving into a kingdom at full strength. It was arriving into a kingdom that had already spent a decade, maybe longer, running on empty. Here is what makes this truly unsettling, if I am honest with you. This was not one terrible summer that everyone could see coming and brace for. It was nearer to death by 1,000 ordinary seasons, each one just a touch worse than memory said it should be, until an entire generation had grown up never quite knowing what a normal harvest actually felt like. How do you defend a border against weather? How do you draft a treaty with a drought? Who exactly does a king send his soldiers to fight when the enemy turns out to be nothing more dramatic than a sky that has simply stubbornly refused to open for years? This is the part of the story I find myself circling back to more than almost any other, honestly, because it refuses to give anyone a villain to point at. No invading army, no cruel decision by a careless king, just weather patient and indifferent, doing what weather has always done, only this time doing it to a world that had built itself just a little too tightly together to bend with it easily. Was this shifting climate the true root of everything that followed the single quiet cause hiding underneath every burned palace still waiting in this story? Or was it only one pressure among several, a background hum that made every other problem, every broken alliance, every unpaid soldier that much harder to survive? Some researchers argue the climate evidence alone is compelling enough to carry most of the blame. Others insist history is rarely that tidy, and a slow drought on its own rarely burns an empire to the ground without help. Perhaps the drought alone was enough to break something this large. Perhaps it only cracked the foundation and something else entirely came along afterward to finish the job. Or quietest of all, perhaps we are still, even now, only halfway toward understanding which parts of this story were nature and which parts were choices made by frightened, exhausted people trying their best. Before we keep going, take a slow breath with me for a second. Wherever you are tonight, no matter how far into this you have drifted, let your eyes rest a little heavier. If a thought about tonight's story is sitting with you, drop it in the comments whenever you feel like it, along with wherever in the world you happen to be listening from. I like knowing how far this small story has travelled to reach you. Now back to the coastline and to the part of this that still quietly gets to me every time I sit with it. When archaeologists finally opened the grain storage buildings at the Hittite capital itself and at a smaller nearby city called Sapinuva, they expected the usual flaws covered in the packed residue of stored barley evidence of a working, breathing administration. Instead, room after room, they found almost nothing. Empty stone floors swept strangely clean. Storage pits with nothing at the bottom but a thin skin of dust and the pale outline of grain that had sat there once long enough to leave a mark, then vanished. In one or two rooms, excavators noted only a scatter of husks pressed into the dirt, the kind of leftover you might find after every last usable seed had already been scraped out and carried away. A capital city home to thousands of people sitting on top of storage rooms with essentially nothing left inside them. Whoever ruled here at the end was not managing an abundance. They were managing a countdown and doing it, as far as we can tell, with a surprising amount of quiet dignity. Kings and scribes were not the only ones living through this. Somewhere in the hill country outside every one of these capitals, a farmer who has left no name behind for us at all was almost certainly making a much smaller, much quieter decision of his own. Whether to stay on land that had failed him 3 years running, or gather what little his family owned and walk toward a river valley that still, according to rumour, had water in it. Multiply that single decision by thousands of households across an entire generation, and you get something historians now consider almost as important as any drought measurement or grain shipment: a slow, uneven drift of ordinary people away from the places that used to feed them. Nobody wrote a treaty about that kind of movement. Nobody carved it onto a temple wall. It shows up instead in smaller, quieter clues. Abandoned farming villages that stop appearing in the record. New settlements popping up in places nobody used to bother. Building herding sites growing busier while old grain-producing towns grow thinner. Was this movement driven purely by hunger families going wherever the next meal seemed most likely? Or did some of it come from something nearer to opportunity people noticing that the old order was weakening and deciding this was finally their moment to claim better land for themselves? Maybe it was almost entirely survival, plain and simple families with no real choice left at all. Maybe ambition mixed in there too, once enough people realised the old kings could no longer stop them from moving. Or, and this is the quiet, uncomfortable possibility worth sitting with tonight, maybe every migration in human history has always carried both of those reasons at once tangled together so tightly that even the people doing the walking could not have told you which one was truly driving their feet. And that grain route we talked about earlier, ships out of Egypt unloaded at Ura, then hauled by ox cart over rough inland roads toward the capital, was never a gentle, guaranteed lifeline to begin with. This stretch of the Mediterranean had a long, uncomfortable relationship with raiders, small bands willing to attack a heavy, slow-moving grain ship, purely for what sat inside its hold. Which means every single shipment carrying that hope north was also quietly a gamble. Have you ever depended completely on a delivery, a shipment, one single supply line, and felt that small, nagging unease when it ran late? Now stretch that same unease across an entire kingdom for years on end, with no telephone, no tracking number, nothing but a dock and a horizon to watch. There is something oddly familiar in these old letters if you sit with them long enough. The tone is not so different from a message any of us might send today when something we have come to depend on simply stops arriving on schedule. Politeness at first, then a slightly sharper edge, then eventually something nearer to open worry, barely dressed up in royal language at all. The alliance we spent our last stretch of time together admiring the brotherhood between kings, the shared standards of trade. The elegant, sprawling web tying every court to every other court was never only a symbol of peace. Underneath the diplomacy, it had quietly become something nearer to a life support system. And life support systems built on distant allies are only ever as strong as the weakest, hungriest link inside that entire chain. For now, though, that chain was still holding just barely one grain shipment at a time. Hatti was hungry, Egypt was stretched thin, keeping its ally fed, and an entire generation on this coastline had grown up learning to measure a good year not by how much they gained, but by how little they lost. Meanwhile, further south along a stretch of coastline that had weathered plenty of storms before this one sat a small, wealthy harbour city, the kind of place merchant ships loved to stop at on their way to somewhere bigger. Its king was about to sit down at a writing table, dip a stylus into wet clay, and put words to a fear he did not yet have a name for. He had no way of knowing it, sealing that tablet shut for the night, but some of the sentences he was about to write would end up being among the very last words his city ever left behind. We are heading there next. The king finishes wetting the clay, presses the stylus into it and begins. Outside the window behind him, the sea is doing the thing it always does at that hour, turning a deep, restless grey. As the light fails, waves folding over themselves against a harbour that has, for as long as anyone can remember, always been busy. Tonight it is not. His name was Amurapi, and the city he ruled sat right on the water, a place called Ugarit on the coast of what is now northern Syria. If you have never heard of it before tonight, you are far from alone, and that honestly is one of the strangest parts of this whole story. Because in its own lifetime, Ugarit was not some minor outpost scraping by on the edge of somebody else's empire. It was one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated cities anywhere in this world we have spent our night walking through so far. Merchants here traded in silver purple, dyed cloth wine and timber moving goods between Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and the Hittite highlands, often within a single sailing season. Walk through its ruins today, an archaeologist will point out entire neighbourhoods of private homes with their own courtyards, and even indoor plumbing tucked in beside temples to Baal and Dagon, and a scribal school where boys and young men trained for years to master not one language but several at once, since a working knowledge of Akkadian Hurrian and their own native Ugaritic was simply the price of doing business in a city this connected. Its scribes did not just copy old texts either. At some point, someone inside the city looked at the sprawling, difficult cuneiform script everyone else in the region used hundreds of separate symbols and invented something almost shockingly modern. Instead, an alphabet just around 30 simple signs able to capture the sounds of an entire language on its own. Somewhere a tired young scribe trainee halfway through memorizing 3 separate languages just to graduate was almost certainly grateful. Somebody had finally simplified at least one of them. It stands today among the very earliest alphabets ever discovered anywhere on Earth, quietly born in a busy little trading port. Most people alive right now have never once heard mentioned. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further tonight. If a city this literate, this connected, this truly ahead of its time, could still end up wiped almost completely off the record within a matter of weeks, what does that tell us about how much wealth or cleverness or connection actually protects anyone when the worst finally arrives? Ugarit had faced disaster before too and survived it. A little over a century earlier, an earthquake had levelled parts of the city, and the people living here had simply rebuilt brick by brick the way port cities so often do. This time would feel different from the very first hour. And Amurapi, sitting at his writing table that evening, already seemed to understand that even if he could not yet say exactly why, there is one more thing worth knowing before we get to that letter, something this city's own archive had already been quietly recording for years by that point. Ugarit sat near enough to the Hittite lands to feel every tremor of the grain crisis we spent our last stretch of time together sitting with. letters pulled from the house of a wealthy local merchant named Urtanu, letters that have nothing to do with soldiers or ships at all, describe something far more ordinary and in its own way far more heartbreaking. One official writes simply that hunger settled over the land of Ugarit, severe enough that he is begging for whatever grain can still be spared, even the smallest remainder sitting forgotten at the bottom of somebody else's storehouse. This was not a city bracing for battle. This was a city already worn thin, quietly hungry, long before a single enemy sail ever came into view. The letter he was finishing was addressed to the king of Alashia, the island most historians now recognize as Cyprus, an old ally sitting just across open water. In it, Amurapi laid out plainly and without much decoration exactly how undefended his city had become. Every soldier he had, every chariot was stationed far away, fighting on behalf of the Hittite Empire, honouring an obligation that had bound these two kingdoms together for generations. Every ship in his own fleet was stationed somewhere else too, patrolling near a region called Lucca, doing exactly what a loyal ally was supposed to do, which meant that on the one evening it mattered most, Ugarit's harbour sat almost entirely empty of anyone who could fight back. There is something quietly devastating hiding inside that detail if you let it sit for a second. The very network of loyalty and mutual obligation we spent our earlier time together admiring kings, calling each other brother fleets and armies, loaned freely between allies had without anyone intending it, hollowed this particular city out from the inside. Ugarit had kept every promise it had ever made to its friends, and on the night that finally cost it everything, there was nobody left at home to keep it safe. It is tempting, looking back from here, to call that a mistake, as if Amurapi should have simply kept his soldiers nearer and ignored his obligations to Hatti. But that reading gives him a choice he likely never actually had. Alliances like this one were not polite suggestions. Refusing to send troops when a treaty partner called on you could unravel the very trade and protection that kept a city like this fed and safe in ordinary years. He was not careless. He was doing exactly what generations of careful, successful kings before him had also done. The lesson sitting underneath this story is not really about one ruler's bad judgment at all. It is about what happens when an entire system is built so tightly around trust that nobody ever quite plans for the one-night trust is not enough. According to Amurapi's own account, only 7 ships were needed to do the damage that followed. 7. Sit with that number for a moment, because it honestly does not add up the way we expect it to. We tend to picture the fall of a great wealthy city as something that requires an equally great army, endless columns of soldiers, a siege stretching on for months. 7 ships sounds more like a smuggling operation than the end of a kingdom. And yet here we are, reading a letter from the king himself, describing exactly that small a force and exactly that much destruction. It helps maybe to think less about the number of ships and more about the number of people who are not there to meet them. A city built around trade rarely keeps a large standing army at home in the first place, not when soldiers are expensive and merchants are profitable, and not when a whole system of allied kingdoms exists precisely, so nobody has to. That system had worked beautifully for generations. On this one particular evening, it simply was not built to answer the one question that mattered most: who is actually standing on the wall right now. So were those 7 ships really the whole attacking force, a lean opportunistic raiding party that simply arrived at the one moment this city had no way to defend itself? Or were they only the leading edge of something considerably larger, scouts and raiders sent ahead to soften the target before a bigger wave landed behind them? Historians studying this letter still argue both sides. Some point out that 7 ships fully loaded with determined fighters could absolutely overwhelm a harbour with no functioning navy left to meet them. Others believe a force that's small could only have managed this level of destruction with help whether from panic inside the city itself or from a second group of attackers the letter never got the chance to mention. Maybe 7 ships really was enough on a night when nobody was left standing at the docks to stop them. Maybe there was more behind them that Hammurabi never got the chance to describe in writing. Or quieter than either answer, maybe the true number never mattered nearly as much as the sheer absolute absence of anyone left to fight back. Before we keep walking through the rest of this evening together, settle in a little further if you can. Let your breathing slow down to match mine. If you would like, tell me down in the comments how far into tonight's story you've made it, and whether your eyes are starting to feel heavy yet. There is no wrong answer, and honestly, if you have already drifted off once already tonight, that might be the nicest compliment this story could ever receive. Hammurabi's letter to Al-Ashir was not the last thing written inside that palace either. A second letter has survived, addressed this time to a nearby Hittite official, stationed at the city of Carchemish, and this one reads almost like a raw, unfiltered version of panic. The writer, quite possibly Hammurabi himself, describes enemy ships appearing directly off the coast, setting up what looks very much like a landing point barely 5 miles from the city walls. He begs for soldiers, he begs for chariots, he asks his lord to save him from whatever this enemy actually is. Picture the room where that message was written. A single oil lamp most likely throwing long shadows across a wall, covered in older Karma correspondence trade agreements, marriage arrangements, the ordinary paperwork of a functioning kingdom. Somewhere outside, past the courtyard, the sound of the city has changed, fewer voices than usual, more footsteps moving faster than they should. And still at the centre of all that, someone sits down, formats the message the exact same careful way every royal letter had always begun, and asks for help using words that had worked for generations before this particular night. As far as archaeologists can tell, that particular letter never left the building it was written in. It was found centuries later, still sitting inside the ruins, never packaged for a courier, never sent on its way south. Somewhere between finishing that sentence and preparing it for delivery, something happened that made sending it pointless. We will likely never know the exact hour that line got crossed, the point where writing for help stopped mattering more than simply trying to survive the next few minutes. But that unsent letter is in its own quiet way one of the more haunting objects to ever come out of the ground. In this part of the world, a government caught mid-breath, still following its own normal procedures, right up until the moment procedure itself stopped meaning anything at all. I find myself thinking about that particular detail more than almost anything else in this entire story, if I'm being honest with you. Not the fire, not the destruction itself, just a person doing their job, writing carefully, formally, the way officials had written to each other for generations, completely unaware they were doing it for what turned out to be the very last time. Was Ugarit simply unlucky, caught at the exact wrong moment with its defences stripped bare by its own loyalty? Or was there something almost inevitable building here regardless, a city sitting directly in the path of a wider crisis, rolling down this entire coastline, no matter what choices its king had made that particular season? Some historians frame Ugarit's end as something like a preventable tragedy, a kingdom that gambled its safety on an alliance and lost. Others see it as one small piece of a much larger storm system already moving, one that would have found this harbour eventually, no matter how many soldiers had been standing guard along its walls. Maybe better defences really could have changed the outcome here. Maybe nothing standing on that shore that night would have made any real difference at all. Or, and this is the version that tends to settle over me longest after I set these particular letters aside, maybe we are the ones demanding a tidy answer from a night that never had one to give. Fire eventually reached the palace archive too, the very room where letters like these had been written, copied and stored for generations. And in one of history's stranger small mercies, that same fire is exactly why we can still study any of this today. The intense heat baked the soft clay tablets rock hard, freezing hundreds of documents in place at the precise moment their world ended, instead of letting them crumble back into dust the way unfired clay normally would over 3,000 years. Ugarit was never meaningfully rebuilt after that. Other cities along this coast would eventually rise again on top of their own ashes. This one simply stopped its ruins, slowly settling under centuries of drifting sand until barely a low mound remained above the surrounding fields. And for well over 3,000 years, that is exactly where the story ended, buried silent and completely unknown to the modern world. Then in the spring of 1928, a farmer working a field near that same stretch of Syrian coastline struck something hard beneath his plough. Not a rock, as he probably first assumed while brushing dirt away with the side of his hand, but a flat, deliberately placed stone, and beneath that stone a narrow passage leading down into an ancient tomb. He gathered what he could reach and carried it into town to sell the way anyone finding old unfamiliar objects in a field might. Word of the find eventually reached the French authorities overseeing the region at the time, and from there it travelled further still, until a young archaeologist named Claude Schaefer arrived the following spring with a small team and a great deal of curiosity. Within weeks, that team was no longer looking at a single tomb. They were standing on top of an entire buried city. And on an afternoon in the middle of May, someone on that team lifted a small sun-baked tablet out of the dirt, covered in a script nobody in the modern world had ever seen before. The very alphabet Ugarit's own scribes had quietly perfected more than 3,000 years earlier. Amrapi's frightened, unfinished words were sitting only a short distance away, waiting patiently underground the entire time for anyone to finally bring their words back into the light. Ugarit fell almost in silence, one small harbour among many along a coastline that was about to lose so much more. Its king's last few sentences were never answered, its soldiers never came home in time, and its story simply stopped mid-conversation, the way a call might cut out before the important part gets said. Further north, though, in the palaces of an entirely different people, a very different kind of warning had already been quietly written down as well. Not in a desperate letter, begging for rescue, but buried inside the ordinary paperwork of a government that still believed right up until its very last recorded day that there was still time left to prepare. We turn there next. That government belonged to the Mycenaean Greeks, and unlike the palace we just left behind on the Syrian coast, the people running this one were not caught off guard at all. If anything, the tablets they left behind tell almost the opposite story entirely. A kingdom that saw trouble coming from a long way off, spent real time and real effort getting ready for it, and still could not find a way to stop it in the end. The palace in question sat near the southwestern coast of Greece, a place later writers would call Pylos home to a king remembered in legend as wise old Nestor. Picture its archive room on an ordinary working afternoon, low light falling through small windows onto rows of shelving. Dozens of scribes bent over trays of damp clay, each one pressing careful little wedge-shaped marks into a tablet with the flattened end of a reed. It would have smelled faintly of wet earth and lamp oil, the quiet, steady hum of an administration that had been running this same way for generations. In its final working season, somewhere around 1180 BC, those scribes were not writing love letters or trade agreements or hymns to the gods. They were writing logistics. Tablet after tablet lists men assigned to rowboats gathered at specific points along the coast, and something the palace clearly considered urgent enough to track in detail. Watchers stationed at named locations whose entire job was simply to keep their eyes on the water. Picture one particular rower for a moment, a man whose name does actually survive on one of these lists, though. History gives us nothing else about him beyond that single line of syllables. He shows up on a tablet as part of a group assigned to a stretch of coastline, one name among dozens folded into a bureaucratic list that some overworked scribe scratched out in a hurry, probably expecting to update it again the following week. He never got the chance. That tablet, along with hundreds of others, was still sitting in the palace archive the night the whole building burned to the ground, and the fire that destroyed his world is the exact reason his name can still be made out today. Stop and notice what that tells us. This was not a kingdom blindsided in a single terrifying evening the way Ugarit's last king seems to have been. Somebody in this government looked out at the horizon, decided a threat was serious enough to organise watch posts and mobilise rowers, and put real administrative effort into preparing for it. And they still lost everything anyway. So why does careful preparation matter so little here? Was the threat simply too large for any coastal watch system to hold back, no matter how well organised? Or did the danger in the end come from somewhere those watchers were never even looking a direction? Nobody thought to point their eyes toward at all. Some historians take these final tablets as proof the Mycenaeans understood exactly what was coming. Seaborne raiders, and simply ran out of time to finish preparing before the attack landed. Others suspect the real danger may have come from inland instead, rival Greek kingdoms' internal revolt, or a raid that slipped through the one gap in the watch nobody had thought to cover. There is a small telling detail buried in these tablets that rarely makes it into the popular retellings of this story. The rowers being mustered were not drawn evenly from across the kingdom. Certain districts contributed heavily. Others, based on the surviving lists, contributed almost nothing at all, whether because those areas had already been stripped of able-bodied men by earlier drafts, or because loyalty to the palace itself was thinner in some corners of the kingdom than official records like to pretend. A crisis, it turns out, tends to reveal exactly how united a place truly was underneath all its shared architecture and shared writing system, and Pylos in its final season may already have been quietly cracking apart from within long before any outside force ever needed to finish the job. Maybe the threat truly did come from the sea, exactly the direction these watchers were staring at every single day. Maybe it came from somewhere completely unexpected instead, rendering all that careful coastal planning almost beside the point. Or, and this might be the hardest option to sit with, maybe it does not actually matter which direction the danger came from, because a system built to watch for one kind of trouble rarely has any defense left over for a different kind entirely. Here is something that tends to surprise people once they hear it, and it might be my favourite strange detail in this whole story. Of all the major Mycenaean palaces, Pylos alone had almost no fortification walls protecting it at all. While kingdoms further north were doing something else entirely with their final years, this particular palace apparently trusted something other than stone to keep it safe. Open trade relationships, perhaps, or simple distance from wherever trouble usually started. Compare that to Mycenae itself, the palace Homer would later make famous as the seat of King Agamemnon, where engineers spent this same stretch of decades doing the exact opposite. Walls already enormous by any ancient standard grew even thicker, built from stones so massive that later Greeks centuries afterward, staring up at the ruins, simply assumed giants must have stacked them there, since no ordinary person could possibly have moved rock that size. Deep underground hidden staircases were carved straight down through bedrock to secret cisterns, engineered purely so a besieged citadel could still reach fresh water, even if every gate outside was sealed shut by an enemy camped on the doorstep. That is not the architecture of a comfortable, confident kingdom. That is the architecture of people who truly believed a siege might be coming, and who were willing to put men on ropes, lowering them down narrow, freshly cut passageways deep into bedrock chisel marks still visible on the stone today, just to guarantee water would keep flowing even with an enemy camped outside every gate. There is a common misconception worth setting aside right here. Honestly, the idea that people this far back in time simply waited passively for disaster to happen to them, the way we sometimes imagine ancient societies reacting to danger. What the archaeology at these sites actually shows looks a great deal nearer to something we would recognize today. Engineers responding to a perceived threat with real infrastructure, coastal monitoring, defensive construction, resource security, the Bronze Age equivalent of a modern city reinforcing its flood walls before a storm season everyone can feel coming. These were not people who simply accepted fate. They were people trying with the tools available to them to outplan a danger they could sense but could not yet fully name. It is worth pausing here honestly because there is something almost poetic sitting underneath these dates. Archaeologists working a little further east at a windswept hill in what is now northwestern Turkey have identified a destruction layer at the site long associated with the legendary city of Troy, dated to roughly this same narrow window of turmoil. If the name means nothing to you, you have almost certainly still absorbed pieces of the story anyway. A stolen queen, a decade-long siege, a wooden horse wheeled through gates that should never have been opened. Most of us picked it up somewhere without ever really studying it. The way, certain fairy tales without remembering who first told them to you. Whether or not a single dramatic war involving that stolen queen and that wooden horse ever unfolded exactly the way later poets described it. Centuries afterward, something violent clearly did happen at Troy right around the time all of this was taking place elsewhere in the Aegean. Homer would not put any of it into verse for another 400 years or so, composing for audiences who had grown up in a world that had lost the written word, entirely relying purely on memory and rhythm to carry a story forward through generation after generation of storytellers. It is entirely possible that the tale so many of us grew up half remembering was not pure invention at all, but a folk memory of this precise chaotic stretch of collapse, reshaped over centuries of retelling into something a great deal nearer to legend than to record. Before we keep going, let's slow down together for a moment. Settle further into wherever you're curled up right now. If tonight's story has carried you somewhere unexpected already, drop a quiet note in the comments, along with the hour where you happen to be listening from. I take those in more often than you would probably guess, usually somewhere near the end of my own day. Now back to those enormous walls and to the ending none of that stone or careful planning ultimately managed to prevent. Despite the cisterns, despite the rowers, despite watchers stationed along an entire coastline palace, after Mycenaean palace burned during this same narrow stretch of decades. Pylos went first and went completely its unwalled halls, offering essentially no resistance once fire finally reached them. Mycenae and the neighbouring fortress of Tiryns followed their massive walls, apparently doing little more than framing the smoke rising up from inside them. Thebes burned too, along with smaller centres whose names barely survive at all, outside a handful of clay fragments. Whatever these kingdoms had been organising themselves against in the end, arrived anyway, and it does not appear to have particularly cared how thick anyone's walls happened to be. What happened next is in some ways even harder to sit with than the fires themselves. In the generations immediately following these destructions, the population across large parts of Greece appears to have collapsed dramatically in some regions, dropping to somewhere around 1/10 of what it had been before. An entire system of scribes, palace administrators, and organised bureaucracy, the very same system that had once tracked rowers and watchers by name, simply stopped existing. The script those scribes used, a system modern researchers now call Linear B, vanished completely, not softened, not simplified, just gone. Greece would not put words into any widespread written record again for roughly 400 years, an entire span of time we now sometimes call quite fittingly a dark age. Try holding that number for a second. 400 years is not a difficult decade. It is not even a single hard century. It is enough time for 15 or 20 full generations to be born, grow old and pass away without a single one of them ever learning how to write their own name down. Whatever songs, contracts, prayers, or private letters that world might otherwise have left behind for us simply do not exist, not because nobody had anything worth saying anymore, but because the very tool needed to say it permanently had quietly gone extinct, along with the palaces that once taught it. So does a population collapse that dramatic mean roughly 9 out of every 10 people in this region actually died? Or does it mean something a little less catastrophic, though honestly in its own way almost as strange, that most of those people simply stopped being visible to the kind of record-keeping that used to count them? Some historians take the numbers at nearly face value, pointing to abandoned villages and vanished settlements as proof of real widespread death. Others argue much of that apparent disappearance is really about scattering families, breaking away from collapsing palace economies into smaller, poorer, undocumented communities that left almost nothing behind for archaeologists to later find. Maybe the destruction really was as total as the numbers suggest, entire communities lost along with the palaces that once counted them. Maybe a good portion of those missing people simply walked away into smaller, quieter lives that history was never built to notice in the first place. Or, and this feels like the honest place to leave it tonight, maybe both things happened side by side. Real loss tangled together with real disappearance, in a way no surviving tablet was ever going to be able to sort out cleanly for us 3,000 years later. Not every corner of this collapsing world came apart quite this badly either, which is its own small mercy worth holding on to for a moment. A handful of places along this same stretch of sea somehow kept enough of themselves standing to carry old skills, old trade connections, even old memories forward through the darkness that swallowed Greece so completely. We will find our way to one of those places later on tonight, and it might be one of the more hopeful stretches of this whole story. But that hope was still a long way off yet for the people watching Pylos burn. It is worth remembering too that not everyone inside a burning palace was a soldier, a scribe, or a king. Somewhere among the ordinary household clustered around that citadel were potters, weavers, children learning trades from parents who had learned the same trades from theirs, an entire working town built up around the palace, the way a modern community might grow up around a single large employer. When the administration at the centre of that world disappeared, it did not just remove a government. It removed the market for everything those households used to make the record of what they were owed, and in more cases than any of us would probably like to imagine the roof over their heads by morning. I keep coming back to that unnamed rower whenever I sit with this part of the story, if I'm being honest with you. Somewhere on his final ordinary morning, he was almost certainly just doing his job, watching a horizon that had probably looked exactly the same for years, waiting to see nothing at all the way most watchers do on most days for most of history. We do not get to know whether he survived what came next, or whether his name on that tablet is the very last trace he left behind. But for one small, stubborn moment 3,000 years later, because a fire happened to bake his tablet hard instead of letting it crumble, we got to know he existed at all. That fire, the same kind that swallowed Pylos, was already spreading through a great many places by this point in our story. And far to the north, in the mountainous heart of a completely different empire capital, of the same Hittite kings whose grain letters we sat with earlier tonight, a very different kind of ending was already quietly underway, one with no fire at all, at least not at first, and strangest of all, apparently no enemy standing at the gate when it finally happened. Let's go there next. That capital was called Hattusa, and if Ugarit's ending was too loud and Pylos's was too fast, this one might be the strangest of the three, because it was almost completely unsettlingly quiet. Built into a steep hillside in what is now central Turkey, Hattusa was by any measure of its time a true marvel. Stone walls climbed the ridgeline for miles, thick enough to walk along the top of, punctuated by gates, carved with towering stone lions, a pair of sphinxes staring outward, and a king's gate guarded by the relief of a striding god carrying a battle-axe over one shoulder. Walk through that same gate today, and the carved figure is still there, worn soft by 3,000 years of rain and open weather, still mid-stride, still carrying a weapon for a war that never came to find him. Somewhere near 7,000 people called this place home at its height, packed into a city so grand that 2 generations of kings before this story's ending had spent enormous resources doubling its size, adding fresh temples, expanding its already impressive fortifications even further outward. For a while, that expansion must have felt like exactly what a confident permanent empire does in its prime, building bigger, because bigger clearly still made sense. None of that stonework ended up mattering in the way anyone building it probably expected. There is something almost unfair about that if you let yourself sit with it for a second. Ugarit's king had every reason to believe his alliance would protect him, and it did not. The people of Pylos built cisterns through solid rock, and it still was not enough. And here in a capital surrounded by some of the most ambitious defensive architecture anywhere in this world, the walls simply never got tested at all. Whatever finally undid Hattusa did not care how thick the stone was because it never bothered knocking. When archaeologists eventually turned their full attention to how Hattusa actually met its end, they went looking for the obvious things. Burned skeletons in doorways, weapons dropped mid-fight mass graves outside the walls, holding the evidence of a final desperate defense. They found almost none of it. No mass graves, no scattered bodies in the streets, no signs of a battle fought and lost at the gates at all. Even the grain storage buildings, the ones we already know from earlier tonight, sat unusually bare. Across this same stretch of years showed no scorch marks from a hurried, panicked fire. Only the quiet emptiness of shelves someone had already taken the trouble to clear. Sit with that for a second, because it truly upends the story most of us would assume by default. This capital had walls other kingdoms in this story would have envied. It had watchtowers, defended gates, generations of careful engineering behind it. And when historians went digging for proof that some outside enemy finally broke through all of that, the ground simply did not agree with the story. So if nobody stormed the gates, what actually happened here? Some archaeologists now believe the fire that eventually did consume parts of Hattusa arrived well after the city had already emptied out, meaning the destruction we can still see today may not even be the true cause of the ending. Just something that happened to an already abandoned shell. Sometime later, perhaps set by squatters passing through, perhaps by lightning, perhaps by nothing more dramatic than an untended lamp catching dry timber. In an empty building, nobody was left to notice burning. Others remain more cautious, pointing out that fire damage is notoriously difficult to date with total precision, and that a smaller, quieter raid could still have happened without leaving the kind of dramatic evidence archaeologists usually expect. Maybe the Empire really did simply walk away before anything violent ever reached its capital. Maybe there was some final, smaller confrontation that time has simply erased too thoroughly for us to recover now. Or, and this is the option that unsettles me most honestly, maybe there never needs to be a dramatic villain at all for an empire this size to come apart, just choices made by exhausted people, one quiet evacuation order at a time. It helps maybe to remember what we already sat with earlier tonight, the drought stretching across these same highlands, the grain shipments arriving late or not at all, the letters growing sharper with worry year after year. An empire does not need an invading army at its gates to start making difficult decisions about where its people can actually be fed. If the land around a capital can no longer reliably feed the people living inside it, walking away from that capital stops being a last resort and starts becoming, in its own painful way, simple arithmetic. There is a second detail here that only makes this stranger the longer you sit with it. Hattusa's archive should by every reasonable expectation be overflowing with paperwork from its very final years. Cities that collapse suddenly under attack tend to leave behind exactly that kind of mess. Half-finished letters, tax records still being sorted, the ordinary bureaucratic clutter of a government caught mid-task. Instead, excavators found something nearer to a library with its most important shelves conspicuously cleared out. Over the decades, this same site has still managed to yield somewhere around 30,000 tablets and tablet fragments in total, an enormous archive by any ancient standard, covering treaties, prayers, medical texts, even instructions for training chariot horses. But administrative buildings that should have been packed with the government's freshest, most urgent records correspondence from those very last, most desperate years held far less than expected, especially compared to what turned up from earlier, calmer decades of the same kingdom's history. Which raises an obvious question. If nobody violently interrupted this government's final days, where did all of that paperwork actually go? The most widely accepted answer, at least for now, is somewhere near unsettling in its own quiet way. Someone almost certainly under direct royal instruction appears to have packed up the kingdom's most valuable records and treasures and carried them out of the city entirely presumably toward wherever the royal court intended to relocate, once Hattusa itself was no longer considered safe or sustainable. In other words, this was not simply abandonment. It looks on the evidence we have nearer to a planned deliberate move executed by people who still believed, right up until the very last stage, that there was somewhere safer left to go. If that theory holds up, and a great deal of ongoing research at this site is still working to confirm exactly how much of it does, then Hattusa's ending truly stands apart from anything else we have looked at tonight. It was not overwhelmed. It was not betrayed by an absent army the way Ugarit was. It made a decision, and then it followed through on that decision so completely that the empty rooms it left behind have spent 3,000 years quietly convincing archaeologists that nothing much happened here at all. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. No matter how far into tonight's story you have travelled by now, let your body sink a little heavier into wherever you are resting. If you have a moment, tell me down in the comments what part of tonight has surprised you the most so far. I always find it interesting which piece of this stays with people longest. Not everything, though, apparently made it out the door. In 1986, restoration workers repairing part of Hattusa's ancient wall near the Sphinx Gate made an accidental discovery that still sits to this day as one of the single most important objects ever recovered from the entire Hittite world. They were not even looking for it. Routine maintenance on a section of stonework chisels and mortar, an ordinary Tuesday of repair work until someone's tool struck something that was not stone at all. Buried in the rubble was a small solid bronze tablet still bearing the faint marks of the chain that once would have hung it somewhere important, heavier in the hand than anyone expects a single small tablet to feel. Engraved across its surface line after careful line was a formal treaty between a Hittite king named Tudalia and his own cousin settling a border dispute over a smaller kingdom to the south, with the same careful formal language every treaty in this story has used so far. It remains the only tablet made of metal rather than clay that this civilization has ever handed back to us, and one of only a small handful of Hittite diplomatic documents confirmed to be an original rather than a later copy. Every other treaty we know from this world, including the very peace agreement between Egypt and Hatti we sat with early on tonight, survives only in clay duplicates, because the original silver and bronze versions were melted down, stolen or simply lost to time centuries ago. This one, buried by accident or by design, somehow escaped that same fate. Here is the part that stops me every time I think about it. If Hattusa's final evacuation really was as careful and deliberate as the empty archives suggest, then somebody somewhere along the way either lost track of this particular treasure or made a very deliberate choice to leave it hidden exactly where it would eventually be found again. A single object made of a metal far more valuable and far more permanent than clay, sitting quietly under rubble for well over 3,000 years, waiting for a construction crew doing routine repair work to stumble onto it completely by accident. Some researchers who study this site openly wonder whether this bronze tablet is not an isolated exception at all, but simply the one piece of a much larger hidden hoard that has already surfaced, leaving the rest of it still waiting somewhere in the ground, in a spot nobody has thought to dig yet. Was it simply forgotten in the chaos, one small object slipping through the cracks of an otherwise careful departure? Or was it deliberately hidden, tucked away on purpose by someone who truly intended to come back for it later and simply never got the chance? Some historians lean toward accident, arguing that even the most organized evacuation in history is never perfectly complete. Others find the location a little too deliberate to be random near a heavily used gate buried rather than simply dropped, and wonder if this was meant as a kind of safekeeping that outlived whoever was responsible for it. Maybe it really was an accident, one small object overlooked among thousands being carried out the gates in a hurry. Maybe someone buried it on purpose, meaning to return and never did. Or quietest of all, maybe the person who buried it did not survive whatever came next, long enough for the difference to matter. The king overseeing all of this, as far as the surviving record can tell us, was a man named Suppiluliuma, the last ruler to sit on Hattusa's throne. He was, by what little correspondence survives from his reign, an active king corresponding with Egypt, sending naval forces to fight off raiders near Cyprus, doing everything a competent ruler in this world was supposed to do to hold a fraying empire together. And then abruptly, the historical record simply stops mentioning him at all. No account of his death survives. No formal record names whoever, if anyone, succeeded him. An empire that had produced treaties, annals and correspondence for centuries, goes within the span of what looks like a handful of years completely silent. Imagine for a moment being the very last scribe still working inside that palace, watching the shelves around you grow emptier by the week, wondering whether the next tablet you press your stylus into will ever be looked at by anyone at all. There is no surviving record of that particular person's thoughts, of course. But somebody had to be the last one still writing, still believing on some level that the paperwork still mattered. It is tempting to take that silence as proof that everyone involved simply died, and for a long time that was more or less the assumed ending historians reach for by default. But there is a gentler possibility tangled in there too, one worth sitting with before we move on tonight. Smaller kingdoms, further south cities with names like Carchemish, appear to have continued for generations, afterward ruled by people who still called themselves Hittite, still used pieces of the old royal titles, still carried fragments of that same culture, forward into a very different, much smaller world. Their monuments carved centuries later still reach back toward the old capital's memory the way a family might keep telling stories about a grand old house long after nobody in that family actually calls it home anymore. It is entirely possible that Hattusa's story does not end in death at all, but in something nearer to a long, slow migration downward and outward, an empire quietly shrinking itself down to something survivable rather than vanishing all at once. Maybe Suppiluliuma's story ended in tragedy we simply have no record of. Maybe he and a good portion of his people walked south with everything they could carry and kept living just smaller and quieter, and considerably less famous than they had once been. Or, and this feels like the right note to leave this particular mystery on tonight, maybe we are simply not owed an ending here at all, only the honest, slightly uncomfortable fact that some empires do not collapse in a single dramatic scene, they just slowly stop being written about. While all of this was unfolding in near total silence up in these mountains, somewhere much further south along the banks of a river that had fed an empire for thousands of years, an entirely different kind of ending was making an enormous amount of noise. Ships burning on open water, chariots meeting infantry along a crowded shoreline. A king determined to make absolutely certain that his version of these events would be the one still standing, carved permanently into stone long after everyone else's story had gone quiet. Two collapses happening at nearly the same moment in history, and they could not have looked more different from one another. One empire slipped away so carefully we are still arguing 3,000 years later over whether anyone was even chasing it. The other was about to fight loudly publicly and with every intention of being remembered for winning. The next part of tonight is already waiting. His name was Ramesses III Pharaoh to carry that name, and for once in this particular story we're about to spend some time with someone who actually won. Picture a temple wall in Thebes on the western bank of the Nile, still standing today, its surface covered floor to ceiling with carved figures locked in violent permanent motion. Chariots collide, ships tangle together in a river mouth choked with bodies and broken oars. Somewhere in the middle of all that carved chaos stands a single larger-than-life figure with an arrow already drawn back, his enemies rendered smaller around him on purpose. The ancient artist's way of making absolutely certain nobody looking at this wall would mistake who the story belonged to. The year by most modern reckonings was somewhere around 1177 years before the Common Era, the 8th year of his reign, and Egypt had just watched the same wave of chaos that swallowed Ugarit Pylos and the Hittite highlands come rolling straight toward the mouth of the Nile. Egyptian scribes called the attackers a coalition of the sea-listing names that still puzzle historians today: the Peliset, the Tjeka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and several others, besides arriving not as a single organised army under one banner, but as a loose mixed collection of different peoples all converging on Egypt's border at nearly the same moment. What makes this particular arrival stranger than a simple invasion is what the Egyptians themselves chose to carve onto the walls of a temple, built to celebrate the victory. Alongside the fighters, the reliefs at that temple show ox carts loaded with women, children, and household belongings, rolling slowly behind the advancing warriors. This was not only an army on the march, it looks on the evidence carved by the very people defending against it, nearer to entire communities uprooted and moving together, warriors in front, families, and everything they still owned trailing along behind. Rameses met them in two places nearly at once: on land somewhere along the coast north of Egypt, and on the water right where the branches of the Nile spill out into the Mediterranean Sea. The land battle involved chariots and infantry clashing along open ground. The water battle was stranger, still nearer to a trap than an open fight. Egyptian ships herded the invaders' vessels toward the river mouths, while soldiers stationed on the banks planted long spears upright in the sand like a wall of iron thorns, making it nearly impossible for any enemy ship to land safely and unload its fighters. Archers on both river banks and aboard the Egyptian ships poured arrows down into boats with nowhere left to maneuver. There is a particular kind of confidence baked into how the Egyptians chose to remember this fight worth pausing on for a moment. Other cultures we have visited tonight tended to leave behind panicked letters, half-finished evacuation plans, records written in the fog of an uncertain outcome. Egypt, by contrast, left behind a victory lap, carved in permanent stone meant to be taken in by every future visitor to that temple for the rest of time. Whether that confidence was fully earned or simply the version of events a surviving government always prefers to tell about itself is exactly the kind of question historians still enjoy arguing over. By the time it was over, Egypt had done something none of the other great powers in this story managed. It survived contact with whatever this moving wave of destruction actually was. Stop and hold that against everything we have already sat with tonight. Ugarit's harbour stood empty when the enemy arrived. Pylos burned despite every watcher stationed along its coast. Hattusa emptied itself out before anyone even needed to attack. Egypt is the single kingdom in this entire story that looked the same crisis directly in the face on open ground, with its full military standing ready and simply refused to lose. So why did Egypt hold when Ugarit, Pylos, and Hattusa all came apart? Was it simply better tactics, a river delta that happened to funnel attackers into a killing ground almost by geographic accident? Or had this wave of raiders, by the time it finally reached Egypt's border, already spent much of its strength tearing through every kingdom that came before it? Some historians credit Rameses with real tactical brilliance, pointing to the ambush at the river mouths as proof of careful planning rather than luck. Others suspect Egypt simply had the advantage of going last, facing an enemy that arrived weaker, smaller, and more exhausted than it had been when it first tore through the Aegean. There is a version of this question you have probably already run into somewhere in your own life, even if it never involved chariots or river deltas. Has a piece of good news ever landed in your lap and left you wondering quietly whether you actually earned it, or whether you simply happened to be standing in the right place after everyone ahead of you had already absorbed the worst of it? Success rarely arrives with a clean explanation attached for kingdoms or for anyone else. Maybe the victory really was pure skill, a defense built cleverly enough to turn geography itself into a weapon. Maybe Egypt only won because everyone else had already worn the attackers down first. Or, and this feels closest to the honest answer, maybe both were true together, skill mattering enormously against an enemy that happened to arrive already weakened enough for skill to be sufficient. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment if you have not already found yourself asking it. If you won a battle that decisively won carved permanently into the walls of your own temple as proof of your greatness, would you expect the story to end there with peace, prosperity and gratitude flowing naturally from a kingdom you'd just saved? Egypt's story did not work out that way at all. Barely 2 decades after that victory, in a village built specifically to house the highly skilled artisans constructing the royal tombs, something happened that had never, as far as any surviving record shows, happened anywhere in the ancient world before. The workers simply stopped working. Grain payments, the wages these particular labourers were owed, instead of coin, had arrived late, then later still, until finally they did not arrive at all. Picture the scene. Dozens of men, painters and stonecutters who spent their days decorating the walls of a king's eternal resting place, setting down their tools in the middle of a working afternoon, walking out through the village gate together past their own small mud brick homes toward the nearest temple, where officials could actually hear them. So the men who carved and painted the resting places of kings did something remarkably direct about it. They marched together, sat down outside that temple, and refused to return to work until somebody in the government finally paid them what they were owed. It is worth pausing on that for a second, honestly, because it might be my favourite quiet detail in this whole story. History's very first documented labour strike did not happen during some later, more familiar era of factories and unions. It happened here among royal tomb builders in Egypt only a few years after their king had personally saved the entire kingdom from foreign invaders. There is something almost comforting in that, in a strange way, proof that ordinary working people demanding what they are owed is not some modern invention at all, but one of the oldest, most human responses we have to being treated unfairly, stretching back at least this far and probably much further than any surviving record can even show us. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your eyes rest a little heavier wherever you happen to be tonight. If you would like, share down in the comments what job you do or used to do, and whether you have ever felt anything near that same frustration those workers must have felt waiting for something you were owed that simply refused to arrive on time. The strike itself was eventually resolved. The workers, after enough noise and enough pressure, got at least part of what they were demanding. But the underlying problem behind it never really went away. The very same grain shortages and strained trade routes we sat with earlier tonight in the Hittite lands were quietly working their way through Egypt as well, just slower and with considerably more cushioning to absorb the shock. A victorious kingdom, it turns out, can still be a hungry one underneath all that stone and celebration, so which mattered more in the end, the battle Egypt won, or the slow economic strain nobody could carve a triumphant scene about. Some historians treat the Sea People's defeat as the headline event of this entire era. In Egypt, the dramatic turning point everything else gets measured against. Others argue the quieter, less cinematic story, strained grain supplies, delayed wages, a government slowly losing its grip on its own internal machinery, tells us far more about why Egypt's golden age was already ending, whether or not a single spear had ever reached its shores. Maybe the invasion really was the larger threat, and Egypt's survival truly hinged on that one battle at the river mouths. Maybe the economy was always the bigger danger, and the invasion simply arrived at an already inconvenient moment to make everything harder. Or quietest of all, maybe a kingdom rarely gets to choose which crisis finally breaks it, only how long it manages to keep absorbing all of them at once before something eventually gives. And something eventually did give, though not in the way anyone watching those temple reliefs being carved could possibly have predicted. For centuries, historians assumed Ramesses spent a long, comfortable reign after his famous victory and passed away peacefully, the way successful old kings in this era were generally believed to. Ancient court documents told a different, considerably more unsettling story, describing a conspiracy hatched inside his own royal household, organized by one of his secondary wives who wanted her own son placed on the throne, instead of the officially chosen heir. Conspirators inside the palace itself, according to surviving trial records, worked together toward a single, deeply personal goal: removing the king who had just spent years defending an entire civilization from outside destruction. For a long stretch of modern history, scholars debated whether that plot had actually succeeded, or whether Ramesses had somehow survived the attempt and continued ruling for a while afterward. The ancient trial documents were frustratingly unclear on that single crucial point, mostly because the surviving text seemed strangely careful about how it referred to him, using language normally reserved only for kings who had already passed into the afterlife, even while describing events that were supposedly still unfolding. It took modern medical scanning technology more than 3,000 years later to finally settle the question. In 2012, researchers ran a detailed scan across Ramesses' preserved mummy and found hidden beneath thick wrappings and a healing amulet. The embalmers had carefully placed there a deep wound across his throat, severe enough that death would have followed almost immediately. Nearby in the same hidden royal cache lay the mummy of another man unnamed on his wrappings, his mummification handled strangely wrapped in material that Egyptian tradition considered unclean, denied the careful preparation given to Ramesses himself. Genetic testing showed the two men were closely related. Many researchers now believe this second anonymous mummy may be Ramesses' own son, one of the conspirators punished even in death by being denied the dignity every other member of his family received. The conspiracy, it turns out, had not failed at all. It had simply been quietly, carefully covered up by whoever controlled the official record afterward. Sit with the shape of that irony for a moment, because it is a strange one. A king who successfully organized an entire empire's defense against a coalition of foreign invaders who planned a trap clever enough to be studied by military historians thousands of years later, never saw the danger sitting closest to him the whole time inside his own household, sharing his own table. I find that detail more unsettling than almost anything else we have sat with tonight, honestly. It is one thing for a kingdom to fall to drought or distant raiders, or a slow unravelling of trade routes nobody could have controlled. It is another thing entirely to survive all of that, to become the one great power in this story who actually won only to be undone by someone near enough to share your own roof. Egypt in the end did not collapse the way Ugarit, Pylos or Hattusa did. It kept its writing, its temples, its long unbroken memory of itself. But something in it had still been badly wounded quietly from the inside in exactly the same years the rest of this world was burning from the outside. The golden age this pharaoh had fought so hard to protect would not last very much longer after he was gone, fading slowly across the following century into something smaller, poorer, and considerably less certain of its own permanence. Later pharaohs would still rule from these same temples, still carve their own names beside his on these same walls, but the era of Egypt standing shoulder to shoulder with Hatti Mycenae and the other great courts of this world as an equal was already quietly coming to its own end. There is a particular kind of lesson sitting inside this pairing of stories, honestly one that took me longer than I expected to fully sit with. We tend to measure a leader or a kingdom by the battles. It wins the wars, it builds the enemies, it turns away at the border. Ramesses passed every one of those tests, and none of it mattered at all against a threat that never bothered showing up on a battlefield in the first place, one that simply waited patiently inside his own house until the right moment arrived. Not every kingdom caught up in this collapse, though, arrived from the same direction or wanted the same things. Some of the very people the Egyptians carved into their temple walls as fearsome invaders may have been something else entirely underneath all that armor families looking for anywhere left standing to call home. We turn to them next. Here is something that tends to catch people off guard the moment they hear it, and it might quietly change how you have been picturing everything we have talked about so far tonight. Nobody in the ancient world ever actually used the phrase we have been using all evening. There was no coalition calling itself by that name, no banner, no shared identity written down anywhere in their own words. The label belongs entirely to us, to two French scholars working in Egypt more than 3,000 years after any of this happened, one of them describing temple carvings in the 1850s, the other popularizing the idea a few decades later, sitting in a quiet study somewhere in Paris, translating hieroglyphs by lamplight from photographs of a temple wall he had likely never stood in front of himself. They looked at Egyptian inscriptions describing invaders arriving from somewhere across open water and coined a tidy, evocative phrase to describe them. Every single person we are about to spend this next stretch of story with never once heard themselves called that. Sit with that for a moment because it changes the shape of the mystery a little. We're not trying to identify one people. We're trying to untangle several different groups arriving at different moments for what were probably several different reasons, all filed under a single modern label, because it made for a cleaner sentence in a 19th century academic paper. It is a little like historians, a few thousand years from now, deciding every stranger who ever crossed an ocean during our own century belonged to one single unified nation, simply because they all happened to travel by boat or by plane. Egyptian sources actually name these groups individually, and following those names backward turns out to be one of the strangest detective stories in this entire evening. There were by most counts at least 5 or 6 of them mentioned by name across different Egyptian inscriptions, some appearing decades apart in different combinations, fighting under different circumstances, which alone should tell you this was never one single people moving as a single body. Take the Shurden, for example, since their story alone should tell you how messy this picture really is. Egyptian art shows them wearing a very particular kind of horned helmet, unlike anything worn by Egyptian soldiers themselves, and decades before they ever appeared fighting against Egypt, that same distinctive helmet shows up somewhere else entirely on soldiers standing guard beside Ramesses, the Great himself serving as part of his own personal bodyguard. Take that in for a second because it is worth letting settle. The very same people who would later show up as invaders listed among the enemies, fought off by a later pharaoh, had once stood near enough to an earlier Egyptian king to protect his life with their own. Somewhere in the centuries stretching between those two moments, an ally became an enemy, or perhaps more accurately, a group willing to fight for pay simply ended up fighting for whichever side made sense at the time. So where did these particular warriors actually come from? Some historians point toward the island of Sardinia, noting later bronze statues found there depicting warriors in strikingly similar horned helmets, and finding the name Shurden a little too near to Sardinia to be pure coincidence. Others are far more cautious, pointing out that a shared helmet style could easily spread through trade and imitation without meaning the wearers all shared the same homeland at all. Maybe the Shurden really did sail from Sardinia carrying their island's particular style of armour with them across the Mediterranean. Maybe that similarity is simply an old coincidence historians have been a little too eager to solve. Or quietest of all, maybe a helmet was never really about where a person was born at all, only about who happened to be hiring warriors that particular decade, and who those warriors were currently willing to fight for. This was not even the first time Egypt had written these particular names down either. Decades before the battle we sat with earlier tonight, an earlier pharaoh ruling roughly one generation before the Ramesses, who would later win his own famous victory, had already recorded fighting off a similar coalition, listing several of these same groups alongside others we have not mentioned yet, warriors the Egyptians called the Ekwesh, the Teresh, and the Luka. Some of those names carry their own tantalizing echoes, the Ekwesh sounding suspiciously near in sound to Achaeans, an old name for the Greeks themselves, and the Luka almost certainly connected to a region of southwestern Anatolia the Hittites also knew well. What that earlier record tells us quietly but firmly is that whatever was happening along this coastline did not begin and end in one single dramatic year. It was already underway a full generation earlier, rising and falling in waves decades before the battle Egypt would eventually carve so proudly onto its temple walls. If the Sheridan story shows us how blurry the line between ally and invader could get the Peliset show us something else entirely: what actually happened to people like this once the fighting eventually stopped. Egyptian records place the Peliset among the groups defeated in that same coastal battle we sat with earlier tonight. Most historians now connect them fairly confidently to a name far more familiar to modern ears: the Philistines, a people who went on to settle permanently along a stretch of coastline in what is now southern Israel, in cities whose names still echo through history today, among them a busy little port called Ashkelon, and others called Ashdod and Ekron, names that show up again and again centuries later in texts far better known to most of us than anything else we have discussed tonight. For a long time, that connection rested mostly on pottery styles and scattered textual echoes. Then a few years ago, researchers were able to study genetic material pulled directly from burials at Ashkelon itself, comparing people who had made their home there before this turbulent stretch of decades against people buried there just afterward. The results were remarkable. Individuals from the very earliest Iron Age layer carried a noticeable trace of ancestry linked to southern Europe, a genetic signature simply absent in the earlier Canaanite population, living in that same city before them. Whoever these newcomers actually were, they had come from somewhere across the water, and enough of them settled in this one particular city that their presence is still detectable in careful laboratory analysis 3,000 years and countless generations later. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people even more, though once they hear the rest of it. That same distinctive genetic trace had already faded significantly within only a couple of generations, blending back into the surrounding local population until it became difficult to detect at all. Think about what that quietly tells us. This was not a small permanent occupying force ruling coldly over a conquered population from a distance the way the temple carvings back in Egypt might guide you to imagine. Within the span of a few generations, newcomers and locals in this particular city were marrying each other, raising children together, and gradually becoming genetically and culturally one blended population, rather than two separate ones locked in permanent hostility. Picture what that actually would have looked like day to day: a household where one grandmother spoke with a slightly different accent than her neighbour, where funeral customs slowly borrowed from both traditions at once, where nobody involved was thinking in terms of conquerors and conquered anymore, only in terms of family. So were the Peliset conquerors, who simply settled down and eventually softened into their new neighbours or refugees, who arrived looking for exactly this kind of new home from the very beginning. And the fighting recorded on Egyptian temple walls was nearer to the exception than the rule of how most of their story actually unfolded. Some historians lean toward conquest followed by assimilation, a familiar enough pattern across human history. Others suspect these were desperate displaced communities, from the start people who had already lost their own homes, somewhere in the collapsing Aegean world we spent our earlier hours tonight walking through, and simply wanted somewhere left standing to finally put down roots. Maybe they truly were raiders first, who only later chose to stay and settle. Maybe they were refugees from the beginning, and Egypt's dramatic carvings only captured their most violent, desperate chapter, not their whole story. Or, and this might be the most human answer available, maybe almost nobody crossing that sea during these particular decades fit cleanly into only one of those categories at all. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your body settle a little further into wherever you're resting tonight. If a piece of tonight's story is sitting with you in a way you did not expect, feel free to drop a note down in the comments along with wherever in the world you happen to be listening from tonight. I love watching how far this particular story tends to travel. It is worth remembering, though, that not every coastal city facing these same arrivals ended up telling a story anywhere near this gentle. We already spent real time earlier tonight with Ugarit, a wealthy little harbour city whose last king watched his own undefended coastline overrun by a handful of enemy ships, his final letters never answered, his city never meaningfully rebuilt afterward. Whatever mixture of raiding and migration was moving along this coastline during these decades, it clearly did not treat every place it touched the same way. Ashkelon eventually became a blended, functioning community again. Ugarit simply stopped existing as anything at all. Two harbour cities likely touched by people carrying at least some of the same names, arriving within a handful of years of one another, and ending up on almost completely opposite sides of the same story. That contrast is worth sitting with, honestly, because it complicates any single tidy story we might want to tell about who these people were. A single label applied broadly across an entire region and several decades of upheaval tends to flatten out exactly this kind of difference. Somewhere inside that broad label were people willing to burn a city to the ground with no warning at all, and somewhere inside that same label were people who simply wanted a quiet plot of land to grow olives on and raise the next generation of their own family. History rarely sorts itself into villains and victims quite as cleanly as we might prefer, no matter how satisfying that kind of clean sorting would feel on a night like this one. I keep returning to this part of the story more than I probably should if I am being honest with you. There is something quietly humbling about realizing that the very same wave of upheaval, terrifying enough to end an empire in one place, could only a short distance down the same coastline eventually settle into ordinary neighbours, sharing meals and marriages within a couple of generations. So where did all of this actually begin? Historians studying this question generally circle around three broad possibilities. Some point toward the Aegean world we spent so much of tonight already sitting with, suggesting displaced Mycenaeans suddenly without palaces, without the economy that used to employ them, turning toward piracy and migration simply to survive. Others look toward Anatolia, imagining smaller groups scattered by the collapse of Hittite authority we walked through earlier tonight, banding together out of shared desperation rather than shared origin. And a smaller group of researchers still favour an older idea that at least some of these raiders were never displaced at all, simply opportunistic sailors and mercenaries who had always made their home along the margins of this Mediterranean world, and finally found conditions chaotic enough to strike where they pleased. Here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment, whichever version of this story feels most likely to you. If your own home, your own economy, your own entire way of life collapsed within the span of a decade, and the sea happened to be sitting right outside your door, how far would you have been willing to travel yourself, and what would you have been willing to do along the way, simply to find somewhere new that was still standing? Maybe the truth really does sit mostly with the Aegean, an entire sea full of people suddenly without homes doing whatever it took to find new ones. Maybe Anatolia deserves more of the blame than popular retellings usually give it credit for. Or quietest of all, maybe there was never one true point of origin to find in the first place, only dozens of smaller unrelated tragedies, each pushing its own small group of survivors out onto the same crowded, desperate sea at almost exactly the same time. Not everyone studying this collapse, though, believes people were even the main force driving any of it. Somewhere underneath all of these ships and letters and burned palaces, a much older, much quieter kind of violence may have been at work the entire time, one with no ships, no armies, and no coalition of any kind involved at all. A force that does not care who it displaces, does not migrate, does not settle down afterward to raise a family, and leaves behind a completely different kind of evidence buried in the ground for archaeologists to eventually uncover. Let's follow that thread next. A force that does not care whether the household inside its path happens to be royalty or refugee, rich or poor, prepared or completely caught off guard. A force that leaves behind no letters begging for help because it never received any letters in the first place, and would not have cared if it had. We are talking this time about the ground itself. For decades, a small group of geologists and archaeologists have argued that a great deal of what we have walked through together tonight, the burned palaces, the collapsed walls, the abandoned cities, might share a single, surprisingly simple root cause sitting underneath everything else. Not drought, not invasion, not a slow unravelling of trade and alliance. Something far older than any of that, a stretch of unusually intense seismic activity moving through this same region across roughly 50 years, somewhere between 1225 and 1175 years before the Common Era. Researchers studying this idea gave it a name that sounds almost poetic for something this destructive an earthquake storm. The phrase is not just a flourish either. Real storms of earthquakes do happen, clusters of tremors triggered along connected fault lines, where one major quake shifts enough pressure onto a neighbouring fault to eventually trigger another, sometimes years apart, sometimes decades apart, marching slowly along the same underground fracture, the way a line of dominoes topples one at a time rather than all at once. If this particular stretch of the Mediterranean sits along exactly that kind of connected fault system, a single geological trigger could in theory explain destruction spread out across a much longer span of years than a single earthquake ever could on its own. Picture for a moment what archaeologists actually look for when they suspect a site was struck by one of these events rather than simply burned by an army. Stone columns once standing upright in careful rows found lying flat on the ground, every single one fallen in the exact same direction, the way dominoes fall rather than the way stone falls when it is deliberately toppled by hand. Walls leaning at angles no builder would ever have designed on purpose, sometimes shifted entirely off their original foundations. Doorway keystones slipped just slightly out of place, the kind of tiny misalignment that only happens when an entire structure shudders violently for a few seconds and then settles back down not quite the same as it was before. And in some of the harder excavations to sit with quietly, human remains found beneath collapsed roofs and toppled walls, in positions suggesting they never had time to reach a door. That last detail is not something historians uncover often in this story. Most of the collapses we have spent tonight walking through left behind letters, empty storerooms, abandoned archives, evidence of people making decisions, even desperate ones, right up until the end. An earthquake leaves behind something colder than that. It leaves behind the simple physics of a building failing faster than a human body can move. There is no letter to find afterward, no warning tablet, no evacuation order, only the honest silent arithmetic of how quickly stone falls compared to how quickly a person can run. One researcher pushing this theory forward spent time studying a mound called Megiddo, a strategic hilltop city sitting along one of the main routes connecting Egypt and the lands further north, a place rebuilt and destroyed so many separate times across its long history that its ruins stack layer upon layer like pages in an old heavily edited book. Several of those layers, dating to roughly this same turbulent stretch of decades, show damage that fits the earthquake pattern, destruction that does not look like fire and does not look like combat, but does look remarkably like the ground simply giving way beneath an entire settlement more than once within a fairly short span of years. So could this single geological pattern actually explain everything we have spent tonight sitting with sites, showing this kind of evidence stretch across an enormous span of the ancient world? Mycenaeans and other Aegean strongholds we already know well, all the way over to Troy, to the Hittite capital, whose empty halls we walked through earlier tonight, and even to Ugarit itself, the harbour city whose last king we sat with, only a couple of stops back. If a single chain of earthquakes really did strike across this entire region, within the same rough window of decades, it would tie together an enormous amount of what otherwise looks like unrelated scattered tragedy. One cause, one map, one tidy physical explanation for a night's worth of separate heartbreaks. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment before we go further tonight. If you learned that a single patient, entirely natural force, something with no intentions at all, no politics, no grudges might be sitting underneath nearly everything we have discussed this evening, would that make this story feel any less frightening to you, or considerably more so? There is something almost comforting about a villain you can name a raider, a hungry neighbour, a broken treaty. It is harder somehow to sit peacefully with the idea that an entire world could simply be unlucky, struck again and again by something with no motive whatsoever, no lesson intended, nothing to learn from except the fact that it happened. Some researchers find this theory deeply compelling precisely because it offers something the rest of tonight's story has mostly lacked: a single testable physical explanation, stretching across the entire map rather than a dozen separate local stories that happen to rhyme with each other. There is a certain relief in that, honestly the same relief a doctor might feel, finding one shared cause behind a dozen scattered symptoms instead of a dozen separate diagnoses to treat one at a time. Others remain far more cautious, and honestly, once you sit with their objection, it is hard not to see their point too, because here is the complication. Some of these same cities had already survived a serious earthquake once before decades earlier and simply rebuilt. Mycenae itself shows clear evidence of quake damage dating back to somewhere around 1250 years before the Common Era. Walls cracked, buildings partially collapsed, the unmistakable signature of the ground truly shaking hard enough to hurt something built from stone. And the people living there did what resilient established communities usually do after a disaster like that. They repaired what broke, reinforced what needed reinforcing, and kept living their lives inside the very same walls for another 60 years. It was not until considerably later, nearer to 1190 years before the Common Era, that fire finally finished what the earlier earthquake never managed to. So if earthquakes alone were reliably fatal to a kingdom, this established, why did the first one only slow Mycenae down for a season or two, while the second stretch of destruction, whatever exactly caused it, never allowed the city to recover at all? Maybe the earlier earthquake truly was survivable, because the kingdom around it was still healthy enough to absorb the damage and rebuild. Maybe the later destruction involved a second earthquake, striking a population already weakened by decades of the drought and strained trade we sat with earlier tonight, no longer able to summon the resources for another full recovery. Or, and this is the answer, more than one serious researcher has quietly settled on, maybe the fire that finally ended. Mycenae had nothing to do with the ground shaking at all, and simply happened to arrive in roughly the same window of chaos as everything else, making it easy, perhaps too easy for a tidy theory to claim credit for something it never actually caused. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your shoulders settle a little heavier into wherever you're resting tonight. If you've ever been through an earthquake yourself, even a small one, feel free to share that down in the comments. I imagine it changes how a story like this one lands hearing it from someone who has actually felt the ground move beneath them. There's a more recent complication worth sitting with too, one that honestly surprised me the first time I came across it. In the past several years, teams of engineers and seismologists have gone back to some of these same Aegean sites with far more sophisticated modern tools than the archaeologists working a century ago ever had access to, running detailed simulations of how the local ground would actually behave during a major quake, factoring in soil density, bedrock depth, the specific geometry of each individual wall, and comparing those simulations against the damage patterns actually found in the ruins. Their conclusions in more than one case have been considerably less confident than the original earthquake theory suggested. Several of the cracked walls and shifted stones, long assumed to be quake damage, it turns out can be explained just as easily by ordinary structural settling, later reconstruction work, or simple centuries of wear without needing a single tremor involved at all. That does not mean the earthquake storm theory is wrong, not even nearly. It simply means the ground itself 3,000 years later still refuses to give us a perfectly clean answer, the same way every other piece of this story has refused to give us one. There is one more thread inside this theory worth mentioning before we move on, because it quietly reframes something we assumed earlier tonight without ever questioning it. One of the researchers who helped popularize this idea pointed out something easy to overlook, that these grand fortified palaces were never built only to keep foreign invaders out. In more than one of these kingdoms, that same thick stone was also there to protect a small ruling class from the much larger population, living and working around them. Farmers, labourers and craftsmen who supported an elite lifestyle they themselves rarely shared in. An earthquake severe enough to crack open those same walls does not just threaten the people inside, it can hand an opportunity sudden and unmissable to everyone who'd been standing outside those walls all along, watching the people who ruled over them suddenly become just as vulnerable as anyone else. Sit with that possibility for a moment because it adds a truly uncomfortable layer to everything else we have discussed tonight. Maybe some of these final destructions were not purely about foreign raiders at all, and not purely about the ground shaking either, but about ordinary people inside these same kingdoms finally seeing their moment, once the walls that used to separate them from power came down on their own. A palace does not need an army camped outside its gates to fall. Sometimes it only needs the people who are always already living just beyond its walls to stop being afraid of what stood behind them. I find myself circling back to that particular idea more than any other piece of tonight's earthquake theory, if I am being honest with you. Every other cause we have sat with this evening involves someone arriving from somewhere else, a raider, a migrant, a foreign coalition crossing open water. This one is different. This one suggests that some of these endings may have come from people who had been there all along, quietly present in every single story we have told tonight, simply never given a name and never given the chance until the ground itself finally handed them one. Maybe the earthquakes really were the hidden thread tying this entire collapse together, quietly undoing structures already weakened by everything else we have sat with tonight. Maybe they were only ever a footnote real in places, wildly overstated in others, mistaken for the main cause simply because broken stone is easier to date than a broken economy or a broken alliance. Or, and this feels like the most honest place to leave this particular question, tonight maybe there was never meant to be one single villain sitting underneath all of this. At all, only drought and hunger and fractured trust and migration, and yes, somewhere in the mix an unlucky, unusually active few decades for the ground itself, all arriving together at nearly the same terrible moment, for no single reason any of us will ever fully untangle. We have spent this entire evening moving through cause after cause. Now honestly, drought, broken alliances, sudden raids, quiet abandonment, restless migration, and now the ground itself turning against everyone standing on it. At a certain point, you start to wonder whether searching this hard for one true answer is even the right way to hold a story like this one. Maybe the honest shape of this collapse was never a single line pointing back to a single cause, but something nearer to a great many small ordinary failures arriving from every direction, at once each one only barely survivable on its own, and completely unsurvivable stacked all together. Not every place caught inside this same 50-year window came apart quite this thoroughly though. There was at least one island sitting almost directly in the path of every single force we have discussed tonight, the drought, the raiders, and yes, very likely the earthquakes too, that somehow managed to hold itself together anyway and even grow stronger while so much of the world around it was falling apart. That island comes next. Remember that letter we sat with earlier tonight, the one written by a frightened king on the Syrian coast, addressed to an old ally across open water, describing his empty harbour and the 7 ships already doing so much damage. That letter had a destination. It was written to the king of an island called Alashia, a name most historians now match confidently to Cyprus, near enough to Ugarit that on a clear day, sailors on that coast could probably make out its hills sitting low along the horizon. So what was actually happening on the receiving end of that letter? As it turns out, Cyprus was not sitting peacefully at anchor, waiting patiently for its neighbour's crisis to arrive. Around this exact same narrow stretch of years, Hittite king, the very same one whose empty, carefully evacuated capital we walked through together earlier tonight, recorded sending his own fleet south, claiming a naval victory over ships belonging to this same island. Whether that campaign was about conquest punishment or simply securing a trade route, that Hatti could no longer afford to lose the island receiving Ugarit's desperate plea for help, was at that very moment dealing with a very serious crisis of its own. Picture that king somewhere on the very same coastline his own copper ships usually sailed from in peaceful years, now watching foreign warships approach instead of merchant vessels, forced to decide how much of his own limited navy he could actually spare for a neighbour's emergency, while defending his own shoreline at the same time. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes the silence in an uncomfortable human way. We do not know whether Cyprus ever managed to send Ugarit any help at all. No reply survives, no record of ships setting out, nothing. It is entirely possible the king reading that letter simply had nothing left to send his own harbours already busy defending themselves, his own soldiers already committed elsewhere. Have you ever been the person someone else reached out to for help right in the middle of your own private crisis, one nobody on the other end of that message had any way of knowing about? Sometimes the people we write to for rescue are drowning in their own version of the exact same emergency, just quietly enough that we never find out until much later, if we find out at all. And yet, when the wider dust of this collapse finally settled, Cyprus did something almost nobody else in this story managed. It kept going. Not all of it, to be honest with you, and it would be doing this island a disservice to pretend otherwise. One busy harbour town on its southern coast, a place called Hala Sultan Teki, was completely destroyed right around this same stretch of years, and never meaningfully recovered its warehouses and workshops, left buried under a layer of ash that archaeologists can still trace today. Several smaller settlements scattered across the island were simply abandoned, their people moving elsewhere, their names slowly fading out of the archaeological record. Cyprus took real damage during this collapse. It was never some untouched paradise floating safely outside the reach of everything we have spent tonight discussing, but three of its major centre cities, called Enkomikition and Paphos, weathered this same storm and came out the other side still functioning, still building, still very much alive as places people wanted to remain. At Kition specifically, the archaeologist who spent years carefully excavating its ruins found something that truly surprised him. Major rebuilding across the site, yes, but no clear evidence of violent destruction at all. No burn layer, no abandoned emergency. Only what he himself described as clear cultural continuity, the sense of a community simply picking up where an earlier version of itself had left off. So why these three cities specifically out of every settlement scattered across this same island? Some researchers point to geography, coastal positions naturally easier to defend or resupply than smaller inland settlements. Others suspect something nearer to deliberate consolidation, surviving populations from smaller damaged communities, gradually gathering into these particular centres because they were already the strongest, best connected places left standing, becoming even more powerful, precisely because everything smaller around them had been stripped away. Maybe location alone explains why these three cities held on while others did not. Maybe it was simply the gravitational pull of power itself, survivors naturally drifting toward whatever centres still had enough strength left to protect them. Or, and this feels closest to how resilience usually seems to actually work, whenever we get to study it closely, maybe it was both at once good positioning, giving these particular cities just enough of an advantage to become the safe harbour. Everyone else eventually gathered inside, and that same gathering in turn, making each of them stronger still, a small self-reinforcing cycle of survival, building on itself one displaced family at a time. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your body settle a little further into wherever you're resting tonight. If tonight's story has you thinking about resilience in your own life, in ways big or small, feel free to share a little of that down in the comments. I always find those particular reflections worth reading slowly, Here is where this island's story starts to feel less like luck and more like something worth truly learning from. Cyprus was not simply a stop along somebody else's trade route the way Ugarit largely was. It was the source. Most of the copper flowing through this entire Bronze Age world, the copper mixed with tin to make the bronze weapons, tools and ingots we have talked about all night, came from mines dug into these same Cypriot hills. Surviving records from centuries before this collapse describe this island sending well over 20 tons of copper to Egypt alone within less than 30 years. That is not the economy of a middleman quietly profiting off moving other people's goods from one harbour to the next. That is the economy of a place everyone else truly needed, no matter who happened to be at war with whom that particular decade. Every kingdom we sat with earlier tonight needed this island's copper for something. Egypt needed it for weapons to defend a border that had already been tested once. The Hittites needed it right up until the moment their own capital went quiet. Even the raiders and migrants crossing this same sea, whatever else drove them from their own homes, still needed bronze tools and bronze blades to survive the journey. In a world where almost every old certainty was failing at once, one certainty apparently held firm a little longer than the rest. Everybody on every side of every conflict still needed copper. Think about what that difference actually means when an entire trading network starts to fracture. Ugarit's wealth depended on staying plugged into a functioning web of alliances and shipping routes connections that could be and eventually were cut in a single violent evening. Cyprus's wealth sat physically underground, waiting in the rock itself, impossible to burn, impossible to starve out, impossible to interrupt with a single bad harvest or a single broken treaty. You can cut off a trade route. It is considerably harder to cut off a mountain. Picture the difference for a moment in more ordinary terms. One kingdom built its entire fortune on being an excellent, reliable middleman forwarding cargo, honouring agreements, keeping goods moving smoothly between everyone else's ports. The other kingdom simply happened to be sitting on top of the one thing every single workshop, army and shipyard in this entire world could not function without. When the middlemen of this world started losing their connections one after another, the miners kept mining because bronze itself, whatever else was falling apart around it, had not stopped being useful yet. At the city of Kition specifically, archaeologists uncovered something that captures this particular strength beautifully. A metalworking area positioned directly beside, almost inside, one of the city's main temples, smelting debris turning up mixed together with religious offerings and sacred symbols in the very same space. Furnace slag beside carved bull horns meant for a god. The soot of ordinary metalwork sitting only steps away from an altar. Whoever ran this operation clearly did not think of copper as separate from the sacred at all. Working the metal and honouring the gods appear to have happened quite literally under the very same roof, as though prosperity itself had been folded into worship, each new ingot cast almost as an offering as much as a product. So was it purely economics that carried Cyprus through this collapse, or did something nearer to identity matter? Just as much a culture that had built its entire sense of itself around this one resource and simply refused to let that particular part of its story end. Some historians lean heavily toward the economic explanation, arguing that raw material control alone explains most of what we are seeing in the archaeology. Others suspect the cultural weight of that identity copper as sacred as much as valuable gave these communities a stubbornness that pure economics alone would not fully account for. Maybe it really was mostly economics, a resource too essential for the wider world to simply let go of. Maybe identity and meaning mattered just as much, a people who saw themselves as the keepers of something sacred and irreplaceable, and organised themselves accordingly even as everything around them burned. Or quietest of all, maybe those two explanations were never as separate as we like to imagine, and the meaning a people attach to their own work is very often exactly what gives that work its staying power in the first place. There is one more piece of this story worth sitting with because it might be the most quietly impressive part of all. While kingdoms elsewhere in this story spent their final years desperately trying to preserve a system that was clearly already failing them, more grain shipments, more soldiers, more letters, begging old allies for help, Cyprus appears to have done something considerably harder. It started changing. Some of the very earliest meaningful steps toward ironworking anywhere in this entire region took place on this island right around this same turbulent stretch of decades, artisans quietly experimenting with a completely different metal one that didn't require importing tin from a mine 1,000 miles away, right as the old bronze economy they had built. Their whole world around was visibly coming apart around them. That is not the behavior of a culture waiting passively for rescue. That is the behavior of a culture already quietly building whatever came next, before anyone had even agreed the old world was finished. Picture a small workshop somewhere on this island, a furnace glowing orange in the dark, a craftsman experimenting late into the night with awe. Nobody around him fully trusted. Yet while news of burning palaces and abandoned capitals kept arriving from every direction across the water, he had no way of knowing that the metal he was quietly learning to work would eventually give an entire coming age its name. I find that particular detail more encouraging than almost anything else we have sat with tonight, honestly. Every kingdom we have visited so far met this collapse by trying understandably to hold on to exactly what it already had: its trade routes, its alliances, its old certainties. Cyprus, in its own quiet way, appears to have been one of the only places willing to let an old identity go before it was forced to and start building the next one early. There is something almost tender in that, honestly, a whole community deciding without any guarantee it would work, to trust an untested metal over a familiar one simply because the world around them had already shown how quickly familiar things could stop being reliable. Not every place facing this same collapse had a mountain full of copper to fall back on, of course, or the luxury of choosing when to let an old system go. For most of this Bronze Age world, the trade network itself, the very thing that had made an island like Cyprus so valuable in the first place, was the thing actually breaking apart beneath everyone's feet, one severed shipping route at a time. And copper, as it turns out, was never really the fragile half of that particular partnership. The truly breakable ingredient in this entire story was sitting much further away at the end of a supply chain so long and so exposed that almost nobody realized how much the whole Bronze Age depended on it until it finally quietly stopped arriving. We follow it there next. That ingredient was tin, and the geography behind it is honestly a little absurd once you actually sit down and look at a map. Copper, as we already know from the same island we just left behind, could be found in a handful of places scattered around this world, Cyprus most famously among them. Tin was a different problem entirely. Egypt did not have meaningful tin deposits of its own. Neither did the Hittite highlands, nor the Levant, nor mainland Greece, nor almost anywhere else, where the great Bronze Age courts of this story happened to be sitting. The Greeks who came after this collapse would eventually speak of a distant source for this metal, only in the vaguest, almost mythical terms: tin islands sitting somewhere at the edge of the known world, a place few of them had ever actually visited and fewer still could point to on a map with any real confidence. The nearest significant source anyone could reliably count on sat somewhere in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, and its surrounding region roughly 2,800 kilometers away from the workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean, measured in a straight line that no actual caravan could ever travel in a straight line at all. Picture that distance for a moment in more familiar terms. It is roughly the same stretch of ground as walking from one side of a continent clear across to the other, except this particular walk involved donkeys loaded with heavy metal ingots, crossing mountain passes, river valleys, and the territory of several separate kingdoms, each one perfectly capable of taxing, delaying, or simply refusing to let that caravan through. Imagine the drivers of that caravan for a moment. Men who spent months of every single year of their working lives on the road, sleeping beside their animals in the cold, watching the same distant mountain ranges shift slowly against the horizon week after week, carrying a metal that most of the people back home relying on it would never see in its raw, unworked state at all. The actual route, as best historians can reconstruct it, wound down out of those distant highlands through mountain passes controlled by whichever local power happened to hold them that particular decade towards cities in northern Mesopotamia, then further still through a narrow trading bottleneck near a town called Amar, before finally reaching workshops in Anatolia and beyond. Every single one of those stops sat inside somebody else's territory. Every single one of those stops was a place where the whole shipment could simply stop moving. This was not a new arrangement invented right before this collapse either. Merchant families had already been running caravans along pieces of this same general route for many centuries. By this point, their contracts, complaints, and shipping records preserved on clay tablets from trading posts far older than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. Whatever finally broke this system in the end was not breaking something fragile and new. It was breaking something that had already proven itself sturdy enough to survive for hundreds of years before it finally could not survive any longer. Here is the detail that tends to make people go quiet once they actually hear it. For a stretch of this trade's long history, the kingdom of Assyria effectively controlled a meaningful portion of this exact route, which meant Assyria held something near a quiet veto over whether kingdoms like Hatti or the Mycenaean courts received the one ingredient their entire bronze economy actually depended on. Not through open war, simply through geography, and whoever happened to be sitting on top of the correct stretch of road that season. So think about what that means for everything we have already walked through together tonight. A Hittite blacksmith forging weapons in the highlands never needed to personally worry about pirates near Ugarit, or drought settling over the grain fields further south, or a single ship's crew getting nervous near the mouth of the Nile. His entire livelihood was still invisibly completely dependent on caravans crossing mountain passes thousands of kilometers away, guided by people he would never meet. Moving through kingdoms he would likely never visit, any one of which could interrupt his supply of tin, without him ever fully understanding why his own bronze had suddenly become so much harder to come by. A war he never heard about, fought over a mountain pass he could not have found on any map, could quietly decide whether his own forge kept working the following season. So which mattered more in the end, the raids, the droughts, and the burning palaces we have spent tonight sitting with, or this much quieter, much longer thread running underneath almost all of it? Some historians treat the tin supply as a real root cause in its own right, arguing that once this single overstretched lifeline snapped in whatever number of places along its enormous length, the resulting bronze shortage alone would have been enough to cripple armies, halt construction, and stall entire economies, regardless of what else was happening elsewhere. Others see the tin shortage less as a cause and more as a symptom, a supply chain that only broke because the kingdoms responsible for guarding each individual stretch of that route were already collapsing for reasons of their own drought invasion, internal unrest. Each one simply too distracted to keep protecting a road that ran straight through their own increasingly fragile territory. Maybe the tin shortage really did strike the first decisive blow, cutting off the one ingredient every army and workshop in this world equally required. Maybe it was only ever a consequence, a symptom showing up, wherever the deeper collapse had already begun elsewhere. Or, and this feels closest to how these enormous tangled systems usually seem to actually behave. Once you study them closely, maybe cause and consequence had already blurred together completely by this point. Tin shortages weakening kingdoms, weakened kingdoms failing to protect tin roots, each problem quietly feeding the next in a loop with no clean beginning left to find. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your shoulders settle further into wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If you have ever depended on a single supplier, A single job, a single source for something your entire life quietly rested on. Feel free to share a little of that down in the comments. I suspect more of us understand this particular kind of fragile dependence than we usually stop to notice. There is a shipwreck worth sitting with here, one considerably less glamorous than the trading vessel we spent time with at the very start of tonight's story, but honestly in some ways far more telling. Found off a different stretch of the Turkish coast and dated to roughly the same narrow window as everything else we have discussed tonight. This particular ship was not carrying fresh copper ingots or gleaming jewellery or jars of expensive resin. Its hold was packed instead with scrap, broken tools, fragments of older bronze objects snapped and bundled, clearly gathered up, for nothing more glamorous than melting down and reusing. A collection of worn-out farming implements, damaged weapon parts, and unidentifiable chunks of metal, too corroded or broken to serve their original purpose any longer, all crammed together the way a modern household might crowd bags of aluminum cans into the back of a car on the way to a recycling centre. Somewhere on land, during these same difficult years, communities were increasingly doing the exact same thing, hoarding whatever bronze they still had, breaking older pieces apart, squeezing every last bit of use out of metal that could no longer be easily replaced. Sit with the contrast between those two ships for a moment, because it tells this entire story almost by itself. One vessel sailing a century or so earlier, its hold packed with fresh copper, fresh tin, fresh luxury goods pulled from half a dozen different countries, a floating symbol of a world still confident enough to trade freely across enormous distances. The other sailing during the very years everything was coming apart, carrying nothing but broken pieces of a system, already running on fumes, patched together, recycled, stretched as far as anyone could still stretch it. Nobody setting sail with a hold full of scrap metal is doing so out of confidence. They are doing it because confidence has already run out, and what remains is simply the practical work of not letting anything usable go to waste. That is not a small stylistic difference. That is an entire economy quietly telling on itself. So how does a world this thoroughly dependent on one impossibly scarce metal ever find its way out of a crisis like this one? The answer, it turns out, was sitting almost everywhere the entire time, just waiting for enough desperation to finally make it worth the trouble. Iron ore, unlike tin, did not require a caravan crossing half a continent to reach. It sat often quite literally in the hills and stream beds surrounding an enormous number of the very communities struggling through this collapse. A village blacksmith with the right skills could in theory dig, smelt and forge iron without ever depending on a single foreign kingdom, a single mountain pass or a single fragile trade agreement to keep the work going. Here is the part worth sitting with honestly though, because it complicates the tidy version of this story people sometimes tell. Early iron was not actually a better metal than well-made bronze. It was in many cases softer, more brittle, considerably harder to work correctly with the tools and techniques available at the very start of this transition. A well-forged bronze blade made by a skilled smith with access to good tin could easily outperform an early iron one in almost every practical sense. Nobody switched to iron because it produced a superior blade. They switched because it produced a blade at all without requiring a functioning empire's worth of trade connections just to get the raw material into a furnace. Think about what an enormous shift in thinking that actually required. For as long as anyone could remember, quality had always meant importing the right materials from the right distant place, paying the right price, maintaining the right alliances. Suddenly quality mattered less than availability. A blacksmith working alone in a small village with no royal connections and no access to any grand trading network at all could now produce something functional using nothing but what the ground around him already provided. Maybe that shift really was purely practical communities settling for a weaker metal simply because it was the only metal still reliably available to them. Maybe there was something a little more meaningful buried in that choice too, an entire world quietly deciding without ever holding a formal vote on the matter that independence from a fragile supply chain mattered more than raw performance, at least for a while. Or, and this might be the truest answer of all, maybe most real historical shifts happen exactly this way, not because the new option was obviously better, but because it was simply the only door still standing open. There is something worth sitting with in that honestly before we move any further tonight. So much of the power structure we have walked through this entire evening, the great kings, the palace economies, the alliances sealed with treaties and marriages had been quietly built in part on controlling access to something rare. A king who controlled a mountain pass or a harbour or a fleet of merchant ships controlled something every rival kingdom desperately needed and could not easily replace. That kind of power depends entirely on scarcity staying scarce. Once that particular kind of rarity stopped mattering, once ordinary blacksmiths could work a metal buried in their own backyard instead of imported from the far edge of the known world, a certain kind of old power lost part of its foundation as well, whether anyone standing inside those crumbling palaces had fully realized it yet or not. None of this happened quickly either, and none of it happened the same way twice in every corner of this collapsing world. Some regions clung to bronze for generations longer than others, hoarding what tin they had left, rationing it carefully for weapons and tools that absolutely could not be made any other way. Some never fully recovered their old trade connections at all, their caravans simply stopping their old contracts, fading into the same silence, swallowing so much of this story tonight. What came next in most of the places we've spent tonight sitting with was not a triumphant new age arriving all at once, but something considerably quieter, and honestly in its own way a great deal sadder, centuries spent simply learning how to survive smaller than before. That comes next. Surviving smaller did not look the same in every corner of this world though, and it is worth sitting with a few of those differences before we let this particular night settle any further. Further east away from the burning coastlines we've spent most of tonight walking through sat the older kingdoms of Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon among them. Neither one collapsed the way Ugarit or the Hittite highlands did. Neither one burned to the ground or emptied out overnight or vanished from the historical record the way an entire Mycenaean palace system did. And yet, neither one simply carried on unaffected either. A little over a century after the worst of this collapse, one Assyrian king did manage to claw back a stretch of real strength, defeating invaders, pressing in from the north, and briefly pushing his kingdom's borders back outward again, his soldiers marching further than an Assyrian army had marched in generations. It did not last. Within a generation of his death, Assyria had quietly pulled back into its own older, smaller heartland content, for the time being simply to hold what it still had rather than reach for anything more. Sit with that particular shape of survival for a moment, because it is different from anything else we have discussed tonight. This was not Egypt wounded from the inside, but still fundamentally itself. This was not Cyprus actively reinventing itself, while everything around it burned. This was something quieter, still an old tired power simply choosing to become smaller on purpose trading ambition for stability, because ambition in this particular stretch of history had clearly stopped being worth the risk. How many different ways do you think can a civilization actually choose to keep existing once the version of itself it used to be is no longer available? Some fight to rebuild exactly what they lost. Some let go of an old identity entirely and start again from nothing. And some, like this one, simply pull the borders in a little tighter and decide that surviving smaller beats not surviving at all. If you have ever had to shrink your own plans, your own ambitions, or your own sense of what your life was supposed to look like, simply to keep going through a difficult stretch, you already understand this particular kind of survival a little better than you might think. Here's something worth sitting with though before we assume every part of this dark stretch of centuries was only about loss. Right around the very same turbulent years we've spent tonight walking through on a stone slab carved to celebrate an entirely different Egyptian king's military victories, a name shows up in the historical record for what appears to be the very first time. Picture the scribe responsible for that particular line working through a long list of conquered towns and broken enemies, most of them places whose names meant nothing at all to future centuries. Carved among that same list in the region of Canaan sits a people. The inscription calls Israel, described in the confident, boastful language of royal propaganda, as already destroyed and its future erased completely. It was not erased. That name would go on to shape the next 3,000 years of human history in ways the scribe carving that boast into stone could never have imagined, tucked in among dozens of other conquered peoples, whose names quietly stopped appearing in any record at all not long after. There is something almost startling about that timing, honestly, once you actually sit with it. The oldest confirmed written mention of Israel anywhere in the historical record appears during the exact same narrow window we have spent this entire night discussing the same years. Ugarit's king was writing his final desperate letters. The same year's watchers were being posted along the coast at Pylos. The same year's grain shipments were arriving late across the Hittite highlands. This was not simply an ending. Somewhere inside all of that ending, new names, new peoples, and new identities were already quietly beginning, long before anyone at the time could have possibly recognized them as beginnings at all. History rarely hands us a clean line between one era ending and another one starting. More often, for a while, both are simply true at once, an old world still visibly burning in one direction, and something entirely new already taking its first uncertain steps in another. Near enough that the same generation could have watched both happening without ever fully realizing they were witnessing either one. Further south along that same coastline, the people we spent real time discussing a couple of stops back, the Peliset. The Egyptians, once carved as fearsome defeated invaders, were busy building something that would eventually organize itself into 5 distinct functioning cities, remembered later as a tight coastal confederation, each with its own ruler, its own particular strength, its own reasons to trade or quarrel with its neighbours. Excavations at one of them turned up evidence of a diet noticeably heavier in pork than anything eaten by their neighbours, further inland sometimes making up nearly a fifth of the animal bones found scattered through household waste, a small quiet marker of a culture holding on to something different from the people surrounding it, generation after generation, through nothing more dramatic than what these particular households chose to put on the table each night. Centuries later, one of these same cities would become one of the largest olive oil producers anywhere in this part of the world, an entire regional economy built in part on groves planted by descendants of people once carved onto an Egyptian temple wall as nothing more than raiders arriving with nothing but ox carts and weapons. Here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates something we discussed earlier tonight. Later accounts describe these same coastal cities holding on to a particular advantage over their neighbours further inland, for some time controlling access to ironworking itself, reportedly even restricting their rivals from sharpening their own farming tools, without paying for the privilege, forcing them to travel to Philistine towns, just to have the plough blade or an axe head properly sharpened. We talked earlier tonight about how this new metal eventually helped break the old world's dependence on scarce distant trade, spreading power out toward anyone with a hillside and a forge. Here in this particular corner of the story, that same technology seems to have done something nearer to the opposite, for a while becoming in the hands of whoever mastered it first a fresh kind of advantage instead of an immediate equalizer. So was iron truly the great equalizer we discussed earlier tonight, or did that levelling effect only really arrive once the knowledge itself had time to spread widely enough that nobody could hoard it anymore? Maybe both things were true, simply at different speeds in different places, the same new tool briefly concentrating power in the hands of whoever learned it first, before eventually spreading far enough to level the field it had once tilted. Every truly useful piece of knowledge, it seems, passes through that same narrow window, at some point a brief stretch, where whoever holds it first holds real power over everyone who does not write, before it eventually becomes so common that nobody remembers it was ever scarce at all. Before we keep going, take a slow breath together with me for a moment. Let your eyes rest a little heavier wherever you happen to be tonight. If there is a name in your own family, a name passed down through generations, you may not even fully know the story behind. Feel free to share a little of that down in the comments. I love thinking about how many names right now are quietly carrying forward stories nobody wrote down. There is one more thread worth following before we bring this long dark stretch of centuries to its end, and it might be the one that ties every single stop we have made tonight together most directly. We spent time earlier this evening with a harbour city that had almost by accident developed one of the very first true alphabets anywhere on Earth, a simplified system of around 30 signs built to represent sound rather than meaning. That particular city did not survive what came for it, but the idea underneath its invention did not disappear along with its palace, the way so much else in this story simply did. Merchant communities further along this same coastline, working in cities that had weathered this collapse a little more gently, kept refining that same basic approach over the centuries that followed, eventually narrowing it down to a lean, remarkably efficient set of 22 characters, simple enough that a trader, a sailor, or a craftsman could learn to make out and write without ever setting foot inside a formal scribble school at all. No years spent memorizing hundreds of separate symbols, no inherited position passed down only within a small, privileged caste of professional scribes, just 22 shapes and the patience to learn them. That alphabet travelled. It moved along shipping routes, planted itself in trading colonies scattered across this same sea, and eventually somewhere near 400 years after the night, this entire story began, reached a set of communities finally climbing back out of a long illiterate darkness. Communities we spent real time with earlier tonight in the ruins of a kingdom whose watchers never stopped watching quite in time. Sit with that number for a moment because we mentioned it hours ago without knowing exactly how the story would end. 400 years of silence, and then quite suddenly, writing again, borrowed, adapted, reshaped, almost immediately to fit an entirely different language than the one that first refined it. Within a few generations, this borrowed alphabet would be modified once more, letters added specifically to capture sounds it had never needed to capture before until it became something new entirely. Here is the part that tends to stop people completely once they sit with it. That reshaped alphabet is quite directly the distant ancestor of the very letters making up every single word of the story you've been listening to tonight. Every sentence I've spoken this evening, every letter forming every word, traces its shape back through that same long chain. Greek to Phoenician, to Canaanite, all the way back to a busy little harbour city on the Syrian coast that stopped existing 3,000 years ago. The same collapse that swallowed palaces, silenced kingdoms, and buried a king's own frightened letters underground for 3,000 years, also almost as an afterthought helped set in motion the writing system eventually carrying words like these into your ears tonight, no matter how many centuries and no matter how many oceans away from where any of it actually began. 400 years is a long silence to sit inside. It is not, it turns out, an empty one. Somewhere underneath all that quiet in coastal towns rebuilding themselves smaller in shrinking empires, learning restraint in newly named peoples nobody had written down before the next several thousand years of human history, were already patiently being assembled out of whatever these communities had left to work with. Nobody living through those centuries could have known that. Most of them, if asked, would likely have described their own era honestly as decline, as loss, as a smaller, harder version of a world their grandparents used to describe in stories. History rarely announces its own turning points while they are still happening. It only lets us see them clearly once we are standing far enough away. We have spent this entire night walking through one collapse piece by piece, cause by cause, kingdom by kingdom. A treaty between brothers who once tried to kill each other, a harbour city that kept every promise it ever made and lost everything anyway. watchers who saw trouble coming and still could not outrun it, a capital that simply quietly walked away, a pharaoh who won the only battle that mattered and still could not survive his own household, raiders who might have been refugees the entire time, a ground that may have been shaking underneath all of it, an island that refused every invitation to fall, a metal so rare it helped end an entire age, and a metal so common it helped begin the next one. Before we let it rest completely, there is one last question worth turning over together quietly before you finally drift off tonight. The question of whether any of this actually stayed safely in the past at all, or whether the same fragile, tangled, beautifully interconnected world we have spent tonight watching fall apart looks a little more familiar than any of us might feel comfortable admitting. Let's turn there now. There is a way of looking at everything we have walked through tonight that pulls all of it together into a single shape, and once you see that shape, it becomes very hard to stop noticing it. Researchers who study the collapse of complex societies borrowing tools originally built for a completely different purpose. Understanding how modern economies and climate systems absorb shock have started describing nights like the one we've just spent together using a particular phrase, a systems collapse. Not one single blow landing in one single place. Something nearer to several different support beams giving way at almost the same time, none of them individually enough to bring the whole structure down until suddenly together they were. Picture it laid out plainly for a moment the way these researchers tend to describe it. First, the people actually running these kingdoms, the scribes, the officials, the entire quiet machinery of government simply stopped being able to do their jobs. Then the class of people who used to rule the kings, the palace elites, the families whose names filled every treaty we sat with tonight, lose their grip entirely, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The economy holding everything together, the shared standards, the trade routes, the careful web of obligation between allies, stops functioning as one connected system and simply falls apart into smaller disconnected pieces. And finally, the people themselves move, scatter, resettle somewhere new in smaller numbers, in smaller places, leaving the grand cities behind. 4 separate failures, each one recognizable on its own. And yet the researchers who study this pattern keep noticing the same thing across case after case in ancient collapses and modern ones alike. These 4 rarely arrive one at a time, politely waiting their turn. They tend to arrive together, each one making the next one worse, each failure quietly removing whatever cushion might have absorbed the next shock on its own. A government too distracted by one crisis to properly manage a second. An elite too weakened to hold a fraying alliance together. An economy too interconnected to fail quietly in just one place without dragging its neighbours down as well. Sit with that list for a moment, because we have now spent an entire night watching every single piece of it happen in a dozen different places for a dozen different specific reasons. Ugarit's government stopped functioning because its own alliance left it defenceless. The Hittite elite disappeared quietly, deliberately, before anyone even attacked. The trading economy holding this whole world together choked on a single overstretched supply chain. And across an enormous stretch of this map from Greece to the Levant, populations simply moved and shrank and rebuilt themselves smaller. None of that happened because of one villain. It happened because an entire world had built itself so tightly interconnected, so efficiently specialized, so confident in its own permanence, that when enough individual threads finally gave way at once, there was no longer a version of that world sturdy enough to catch itself. There is a particular kind of comfort people often reach for when a story like this one gets told the comfort of a single clean answer. Was it the drought? Was it the raiders? Was it the earthquakes? We spent an entire night honestly chasing exactly that kind of answer, turning over one possibility after another, and I hope by now you have made peace with the fact that no single one of them was ever going to be enough on its own. That was never a failure of this story to find its ending. That was the actual ending the whole time, just not the kind most of us are used to being handed. Before we keep going, settle in a little further if you can. Let your breathing slow down to match the pace of my voice. Wherever you started tonight's story, whatever part of the world you're hearing this in right now, I hope the hours in between have treated you gently. Here is the part of tonight's story I think about longer than almost anything else, if I am being honest with you. We are inside a version of that same idea today, whether we usually stop to notice it or not. A single blocked shipping lane on the other side of the planet can leave store shelves empty in a town most of us have never heard of. A single factory pausing production can quietly stall an entire industry built on parts nobody realized came from just one place. A shortage in one narrow specialized material sitting somewhere far outside most of our daily awareness can ripple through prices, jobs, and entire supply chains before most people even learn the name of the thing that ran short in the first place. Have you ever noticed a small ordinary item quietly missing from a store shelf week after week with no clear explanation offered anywhere, and felt that same small uneasy question a Hittite official must have felt watching a grain shipment fail to arrive on schedule, a question with no comfortable answer attached to it? Most of us have felt some small version of that particular unease at some point, a delivery running late, a familiar product suddenly gone, a service we depend on quietly changing without warning. Small moments that rarely mean very much on their own, but that occasionally hint at something larger, moving underneath somewhere far outside our own line of sight. We built a world even more interconnected than the one we spent tonight watching fall apart, trusting in our own quiet way. Exactly the same thing those Bronze Age kings once trusted, that a system this efficient, this elegant, this deeply woven together was simply too valuable to ever actually break. So is that comparison actually fair, or are we borrowing a little too much drama from a truly different, much older world? Some researchers find the parallel remarkably precise, arguing that modern global trade, modern climate stress, and modern institutional fragility echo this exact same pattern, closely enough to take real practical lessons from it. Others urge caution, pointing out that our world has tools, knowledge, and flexibility. No Bronze Age kingdom ever had access to safety nets this older world could not have imagined, and that borrowing too heavily from a 3,000-year-old collapse risks turning a useful metaphor into something nearer to fear for its own sake. Maybe the comparison really does hold up as tightly as it feels tonight, a real warning worth carrying with us. Maybe our own version of resilience, the knowledge, the flexibility, the sheer scale of what we have since learned to build means this particular story stays safely behind us as history rather than as prophecy. Or, and this feels like the honest place to leave this thought, before we bring tonight's story to its end, maybe the actual lesson was never about predicting exactly how or when a system like ours might strain. Maybe it was always simply about remembering that it can and letting that memory shape how carefully we tend the threads, holding our own world together quietly on ordinary days long before any of us ever have to find out the hard way. There is one thread running through tonight's entire story worth pulling out and holding on to a little longer than the rest before we let this night rest completely. Every kingdom we sat with tonight that survived in any real lasting way did so through some version of the exact same quality, and it was almost never raw strength alone. Egypt won its most famous battle decisively, and still spent the following decades quietly weakening from the inside. Hattusa's mighty walls never even faced an enemy. What actually seemed to matter again and again was something nearer to willingness to change course before being forced to willingness to let an old identity go, willingness to build something smaller and stranger, rather than cling stubbornly to something familiar that had already stopped working. Cyprus experimented with an entirely untested metal while its neighbours were still writing increasingly desperate letters, begging for more of the old one. That more than any wall or any army or any treaty is what seemed to actually decide who made it through this particular collapse and who did not. That is worth sitting with, honestly, long after tonight's story ends. Resilience, it turns out, rarely looks like refusing to bend. More often it looks exactly like bending early before the alternative becomes breaking completely. Think back for a moment to the very beginning of tonight's story, that small trading ship easing out of a quiet harbour, its hold packed with cargo from half a dozen different lands, sailing toward a world so richly connected, it must have felt to the people living inside it permanent. Nobody standing on that dock watching that captain count his crates by torchlight could have imagined the shape of everything. We have spent tonight sitting with the letters, the fires, the quiet evacuations, the 400 years of silence that followed. That same interconnected trust carried this world to extraordinary heights for centuries. It also in the end made it fragile in ways nobody standing on that dock could have possibly imagined. You're sitting right now inside your own version of that same trust. The lights in your home, the food in your kitchen, the small conveniences most of us barely think to be grateful for most days. All of it depends on countless threads stretching further than any of us could ever fully trace, on our own minds and farms and factories scattered across a dozen countries. You will likely never visit run by people whose names you will never know, exactly the way that Hittite blacksmith never knew the name of a single person driving the caravan his own livelihood quietly depended on. That is not a reason to be afraid tonight. It is simply the quiet, honest shape of the world you were born into, the same shape in its own way that a scribe in Ugarit, a rower at Pylos, and a blacksmith learning to work iron on a Cypriot hillside were all quietly living inside as well, each of them doing the best they could with what they had, exactly the way you are doing tonight. And maybe that is the gentlest way to carry this particular story forward with you past tonight, past this video, into whatever your own ordinary days look like from here. Not as a warning to lie awake over, simply as a quiet kind of company, the knowledge that every single person you have met tonight, every king, every rower, every anonymous farmer walking toward a river valley that still had water in it, was doing exactly what you're doing right now, living inside a world too large and too tangled for any one person to fully see, and finding their own small way to keep going anyway. I want to say thank you honestly for staying with me through this entire story tonight. Nights like this one take a long time to put together, properly chasing down old letters, old excavation reports, old arguments between historians who still cannot fully agree on what happened, and getting to walk through all of it with you. One quiet stretch at a time is not something I take for granted. If any part of tonight stayed with you, a single detail, a single moment, a single question, you're still turning over in your mind, that alone makes every hour spent researching and writing this worth it. If tonight gave you even a little bit of that slow, sleepy comfort you came looking for, like helps more than you would probably guess, and it cost you nothing but a tap. And if you have a spare moment before sleep finally pulls you under, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be where you are. I take in those little messages more often than you might expect, usually somewhere quiet near the end of my own day too. If you are new here and something about tonight's way of telling history felt like the kind of company you would want, again consider staying a while. There are more nights like this, one waiting more forgotten corners of history, more quiet mysteries worth sitting with slowly together exactly like this. Subscribing costs nothing, and it simply means you will not miss the next one whenever it arrives. For now though, let the lights stay low and let your thoughts drift wherever they want to drift. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Not the dates, not the names, none of it. Just let it settle, soft and slow, the way the best stories always do right before sleep finally takes over. Wherever you are tonight and whoever you are sharing this quiet hour with, even if that is only yourself, I hope it has been a good one. Sleep well. I will see you in the next story.